In this course, we're going to deploy Django to Railway through GitHub. Now, there are other ways on how to do this, and Railway already has documentation on how it's done. I already have a blog post on how it's done, as well as an actual template on how you can deploy it right now. It only takes a few moments. But for those of you who want to go in depth, that's what this course is all about. We're going to go from absolute zero deploying Django itself. And the version of Django we're going to be using is a pre-release version, which is called 5.2. Django 5.2 is what we're going to be working with because that's right around the corner. And we're going to be using, of course, Python 3.13. Then we're also going to be using the Cursor text editor, Git, which is version control, which should come with Cursor itself. And then also an optional thing that you might want to have on your local machine is Docker. But the vast majority of this is all about creating a basic Django project that we can deploy. Just because it's basic doesn't mean it's not going to give you the foundation to make a really advanced Django project, which is exactly what we're going to do little by little. Let's jump in. First things first, we need to make sure that we have a Python virtual environment. Now, if you're not familiar with this process, it's really how we isolate Python projects from one another, or if our system is using Python at all, we want to make sure we're isolating versions of our code from the system Python code as well. So we create a virtual environment, then we're going to install. In our case, we're installing the pre-released version of Django, but you're going to want to get 5.2 whenever that actually gets released. Do keep in mind that the reason I'm using 5.2 has to do with the fact that it's a long-term support release, or an LTS, which is 2025 right now. It's going to be supported well into 2028, which is a lot longer than the other versions that are currently out, which is exactly why we're using 5.2. Okay, so the idea then is we want to install Django 5.2 in that virtual environment. Now, if you don't have Python installed or you've never created a virtual environment before, check out my YouTube channel at cfe.sh/YouTube. Look for the system setup section. This installs older versions of Python, but the process is still almost identical to that. Now, if you want a newer version of that, there's this course called Cross-Platform Python Setup. This goes into a lot more of the Linux stuff and using a remote virtual machine if you want to go that route. Now, the idea here, though, is you need to have Python installed. In our case, we're using Python 3.13, but basically anything after Python 3.10, you should be good. Okay, so with this in mind, we now need to create our folder or directory where we're going to store our Django project. Now, typically speaking, I use Terminal to maybe get this part started, and then I move into a text editor or code editor like Cursor. I've used VS Code for a long time, Sublime Text before that, but the idea here is we want to eventually move into Cursor and use the Cursor terminal. If you are on Windows, I recommend eventually using WSL or Windows Subsystem for Linux because it's going to feel a lot more like what we're doing in this one, or maybe using PowerShell, but the commands in there are just slightly different. But the idea here is let's go ahead and make our directory here. I'm going to go ahead and do make dir-p ~dev/deploy-Django. Now, if you're not familiar with all these commands, this is making a directory, and this -p is saying, hey, if it already exists, no worries. If it doesn't exist, create all of the folders leading up to the one we have. So in other words, if you don't have this dev folder here, it will create that one. And this / is doing it in my user's root folder. The nice thing about this is then I can just go ahead and do cd ~dev deploy Django. Oops, let's do dev/deploy-Django like that. And there we go. So now we're in our project's root. And so what we do here is we use Python 3.12 or 3.13, depending on which one you use. Then you do your module, venv. So this is the built-in command that Python has to create the isolated virtual environment. There are other tools to do this, like UV is something, Poetry is something. Feel free to switch if you'd like. This to me works all of the time. I have the most consistent success with using the built-in Python one, but of course UV is a very popular one right now that might be well worth checking out. Nevertheless, we create that virtual environment, and then we're going to go ahead and activate that virtual environment, and then we'll go ahead and do pip install --pre of Django. Yours will probably not be pre. Instead, yours will probably be Django greater than or equal to 5.2.0. and then maybe comma less than 5.3.0 or something like that. That might be what you end up doing in the future. And then we'll go ahead and do -- pre here, and this will go ahead and run, in my case, the pre-release of 5.2, which should be out very, very soon. Okay, so with this in mind, I'm going to go ahead and create a source folder. So I'll go ahead and do make dir src. I'm going to navigate into src, and then I'll go ahead and do django-admin and start project cfe home, period. Okay, so this has now created my Django project, which I can run with python manage.py run server, and there we go. So we now have our Django project up and running, which I should be able to open this up in my web browser, seeing this success page. Now, the reason I went fast here was for those of you who already know how to do this, maybe using other tools, maybe using a different process. This is the process I'm going to be taking. And if I went way too fast for you, or if this is like something you haven't seen before, then you're going to probably want to check out some of my beginner Django stuff on my website. You can check out the first Django project course itself. So if you do a quick search for that on my website, you will see the course itself, your first Django project, and you'll probably want to go through that one. That's an in-depth look at building out your first Django project. This is not really that. We are going to be deploying, which kind of assumes that you know a little bit about this, but mostly if this was way too fast for you, then that's well recommended at this point. For the rest of us, let's keep going. Go ahead and close out the hello world for your project with Control-C. Control-C, as you may know, is a way to stop programs from running. This is true with Django as well as many others. So if we hit Control-C, that will stop it, and then I'm going to go ahead and type out cursor period. This should actually open up the cursor editor for me. Now, of course, if it didn't open it up for you, then feel free to go into creating a new window in cursor, go to open folder, and then just navigate to that deploy Django folder that we just created. The point is you want to have src in here, not just the Django stuff. So I actually opened it up in the wrong spot on my text editor or on my terminal window itself. So let's go ahead and have it with the root where we can see the virtual environment. A lot of different reasons for this. The main one being that typically speaking, when you're deploying a Django project or really a lot of software, you have a specific folder where the code actually exists. Then you have a project folder, which is often your GitHub repo, where you're going to store things about your project. So like a README file, for example, or in our case, a git ignore file that you're going to definitely want to have in here. So when it comes to deploying, especially through Python and Git, you need to have something called a git ignore file. So I usually do Python git ignore. I still do this all of the time, and I grab the one directly from GitHub, and then I just copy this value and paste it in here. That usually covers everything for me. Every once in a while, if I need to use something like Tailwind CSS right inside of here, I might then do the Node.js git ignore as well, and quite literally grab that one too, copy that, and bring it to the bottom of this just like that. The main thing at the very top, though, is what I want to do is a .ds store. This is for those of you who are using a Mac, just like me. So using Git, this is an important part of setting up your project as well, in which case you're going to want to open up the terminal here, which you definitely want to get used to this shortcut because I end up toggling it all of the time, which you should as well. So it's really just Control tilde, and that just toggles it just like that. And then, of course, you can create and destroy terminals in here whenever you want to. Now, of course, this is going to replace using the actual terminal window that we did inside of Mac itself, or if you're on Windows, PowerShell or WSL. VS Code, Cursor, Windsurf, a lot of the modern text editors have a terminal window built in, and that's what we're going to be working off of. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and do git init, and I want to initialize my Git repo here, and then I'm going to go ahead and do git add -- all, and then I'm going to do git commit -m, and we'll go ahead and say initial commit for the project. And then I'm going to be pushing this into GitHub very, very soon. The point here is not to teach you or learn everything about Git itself. A big part of the reason you wouldn't spend that much time learning about Git has everything to do with modern code editors themselves, although I do recommend learning it. So for example, if I go into settings.py and I want to make a change here, let's say for instance this secret key, I don't want it inside of my code, which you never want to commit secrets into your code ever. I'm going to go ahead and do something more like os.environ.git, and we'll call this our Django and secret key, something like that. Now I save it with Command S. Notice that it's yellow now. It's been modified. The actual text editor itself, or the code editor, is showing this Git stuff being happening. So then you can open up the little icon for Git, which is exactly what this icon is. And you can see there's changes in here. You can compare the changes. Red means it was removed. Green means it was added. You can see all of those changes in there. And then you can say something like updated settings, right? And you commit it. You can commit it directly. You can say yes. And then boom, now it's committed and it's going to be tracked once we send it to GitHub. So I'm not going to go through Git itself. It is a tool that's well worth learning, but I will show you the necessary commands to actually deploy to GitHub or push it to GitHub, which is not going to be a whole lot different than what we did right there. Okay, so with this in mind, let's go ahead and go to the next part where we actually set up our Git repo and push our GitHub project itself. We now need to connect our local machine to GitHub. Now, GitHub itself will store the code for us, and it can do this privately or publicly. In our case, we're really just using the GitHub CLI for logging into GitHub. Now, this will be really useful for you if you want to use AI to do all sorts of stuff with GitHub, which we'll talk about in a moment. But the idea here is you need to download and install the GitHub CLI. You need to log into the GitHub CLI so that Git, G-I-T, by itself has access to GitHub, and you can just push your code in, as we'll see in a moment. So what you want to do now is you can install the GitHub CLI in a couple of different ways. Of course, if you're on Mac, these two commands will work for you, and they should install it into the actual terminal window itself. Now, if you have Homebrew installed, that's where you can do the brew command itself. So if you actually went through here, you copied this command here, jumped into your terminal window, and then typed that in, this will install Homebrew for you. So you can do something like brew search GH, and that will allow you to search for the GitHub CLI. Of course, there's a lot of things that include GH in here, but as you can see, I actually have the GitHub CLI installed this way. If you're on Windows, this process will be slightly different, but it should be able to install on Windows as well, because of course, Microsoft owns GitHub if you weren't aware of that. So it definitely has a way to install the GitHub CLI on Windows as well. It's just a little bit easier on Mac or Linux. Okay, so the idea here is once you have the CLI, you're going to log into GitHub. So let's actually start that process of logging into GitHub. Now, how you do this can be inside of any of your terminal windows. The idea is GH should be installed, so you should be able to see this right here, in which case we have, if you scroll up, there's this GH and auth command. That's the one we're going to be doing. There's a lot of things you can do with the GitHub CLI or with GitHub in general. So if you do GH auth and then log in, it will prompt you with a few different things. We want to log in directly through github.com, but the reason it does this is because you can actually log in to other services that might use this CLI, which is really cool. It's nice that GitHub does that. Nevertheless, we're going to go ahead and use HTTPS to log in. You can use SSH if you know how to do that. That's a little bit more advanced, but HTTPS is the easiest one, so that's what we're going to do. And we're going to go ahead and log in with a web browser. Notice that it gives you a one-time code, which we're going to go ahead and copy. And then we're going to go ahead and hit enter to open up this URL for us. Then you're going to log in with the project you want to log in with. Notice I have two of them. You can use as many projects as you want. You can switch things around and stuff too, which is really nice. Maybe not as many as you want, but I have had no problems with like 5 projects. So nevertheless, you're going to put that code in. You're going to go ahead and hit continue. Then you're going to want to authorize this, which is absolutely what we're going to do. Then, of course, you're going to log in to your password there, in which case I'm going to go ahead and just log in. Then you'll see something like this, and your device is connected. On your local machine, you will see, yeah, you're logged in. So if you ever need to log out, you just do auth log out. And then it's going to say, hey, you're now logged out, in which case you'll have to repeat that process all over again, which is not really that big of a deal now that you know how to do it, and you will be able to do it with other projects as well, and then sign in again, code again, and all that. And I might actually have to authorize it again. Looks like I do. I didn't have to log in again because I literally just did it. But nevertheless, we now have our device activated into GitHub itself. So the next step then would be the really simple part of creating a new repository. Now we can use the GitHub CLI to do this, But in my case, I'm just going to go ahead and create one in here. And I'm going to call this repository deploy Django. And then I'm going to go ahead and have it as a private one, as in nobody else can see this. Now, even with private ones, you want to be very careful about the security keys, the API keys you put in your private repository. We'll talk about this more later. Now, we don't need to initialize this repository with anything. Notice there's a git ignore in here already. There's a license, there's a README file. These sorts of things you can do off of this, but the main one was we already have a git ignore file. That's why I wanted to show you before. So we're going to go ahead and create this repository. I created it with nothing. So it's automatically saying, hey, add this stuff in here, basically because we already have one, right? Or push an existing one, rather. So we can come in here and do these commands right here. Now, if you don't see this, if you see like some information about your project and it's a README file, just go ahead and delete the repository itself. Just scroll into settings and hit delete repository and do it from scratch with nothing in it. Now, that's of course for those of you who have never done this process before. So nevertheless, we're going to go ahead and copy this command here, and then I'll go ahead and paste it in my local machine in the root of my project. So let's go ahead and make sure that I can do git status, for example. I see that it says nothing to commit. This is where I'm going to go ahead and add that origin. Now, if you ever want to remove a repository, the remote, you just go ahead and say remove origin, and then it's gone. Okay? Once you do that, you can do git remote and then -v, capital V, or rather lowercase v, and then you can see the actual repository you're using here. And you can have a lot of them in here. You don't have to just have the origin one. That's just the standard name that we give GitHub. You could always call git remote add GitHub and then do that as well. The point of this is this local machine now knows, hey, where should we push this code? So when we run git push, it will quite literally push that code there. And so this process is something you won't necessarily have to do very often, but the point is your local machine needs to know where to send it, and that's the address. That's what this remote origin is. It's kind of like sending an email, but it's not an email. It's using Git, and it's sending all of our code right into GitHub, which we can see if we look at GitHub itself, there it is. So we've got all of our code in here. After I refresh the page, I can see here's SRC and all this. Let's talk about why we use Git. Now, right away, you probably already noticed that we can use Git to share our code wherever we might want to. Right now, we're sharing our code on GitHub, but the nice thing is we can just move that code really simply with that git push command. Now, we'll see that command many more times throughout this one, but the idea here is if we actually go into our Git repo, I could download the code with zip, and I don't actually need to use Git itself. I could just download code this way. So it's a really nice way to share code. Now, that's a big part of the reason GitHub is so popular, is that so many developers can go on there and grab code from other developers that have decided to share it freely. And you could decide that as well, of course. Now, GitHub itself is not the only location that you can do this. You can do Bitbucket, it's another place to host code. GitLab, yet another place. And you can even spin up your own version of these things with Git directly and just use Git to host your code as well. Now, of course, Git is a major improvement from something called FTP. So it's not really just about sharing the code. It's not really about sending it somewhere. FTP did that as well. Git itself does something better than that, which is tracking the changes over time. So if we actually take a look inside of our project here, and let's say, for instance, we deleted settings.py altogether, right? Just gone. And I open up a new terminal window here, and let's go ahead and make sure that my virtual environment is activated, which if I do pip freeze, it looks like it is. I'm going to go ahead and go into my SRC here, and I'm going to go ahead and run Python and manage.py run server. Right away, I see that it says no module name CFE home. So if I catch this early, I'll be able to maybe bring it back, but the question is, of course, how would I actually bring that file back? Now, let's go ahead and make the mistake even worse by committing these changes, by doing git add --all, git commit, and I'll go ahead and say made some updates right now, and then I'll go ahead and actually push this change as well. So not only did I remove the file on accident, but I also pushed it into GitHub also. So if I go onto GitHub here, I can refresh and I can go into SRC, into CFE home, settings is gone. This is not great. We're not in a really good spot here. So how do we actually bring it back? Now, there's a lot of different ways on how we could go about doing this. One of the things is by going into GitHub directly, going into history, and you can see all of the changes on this project itself. So if we go into update settings here, you can see, hey, there's settings.py. Now, there's other ways to explore the GitHub repo itself. I'm not going to look at those right now. Instead, what I'm going to do is go back into my local project and I'm going to do git log. Git log is super nice because it will show you the changes that you've made and committed to GitHub over time. So the nice thing about this is we've got this updated settings here. This is likely a place where I can use my old settings. So without going into too many details of all the different things you can do with GitHub, I'm going to just go ahead and grab the ID of this commit, this whole thing. I'm going to copy this and I'm going to go ahead and close that out with a Q. And then I'm going to go ahead and run git reset that value -- hard. This should bring settings.py back to us. That's great. Now I can make sure that GitHub itself has that file as well. Now the way I'm going to do this is by doing git push -- force. If I hit enter, this will push it to that project as well or back into GitHub, which removes that old history, which you may or may not want to do. So if you're learning, this method is great. If you're going into production or if you're working on a big team and you're using a real project, this is not what you're going to want to do. You're going to want to learn more about the advanced features that Git has to overcome these situations, which hopefully doesn't happen very often. But the reason that I'm showing you this is twofold. Number one, you're going to want to commit your changes frequently, right? So for example, you make a big change like debug, and we can even say it's equal to true or something like that. You could do some big change like that. As soon as you do a change like that, you're going to want to do git status just to make sure that you see it. You can run git diff, which shows you in the command line what changes. Or of course, you could use cursor or VS Code or whatever to see inside of Git the changes that are happening like that. Either way, whatever you end up doing, you make some changes, then you're going to want to go to this message here and say updated debug setting, hit commit, say yes. You could always say always as well. I'll keep this up as a prompt every time for the series, but if I go ahead and hit sync changes, I'll go ahead and say okay. This will sync it to the remote repository, as in on GitHub, and if we scroll down here, we should be able to see that new change. So the point here is you're going to want to track these changes over time, because if you use something like Cursor's agent will add and delete files for you frequently. So the idea of using that git reset is going to become even more of a thing that you're going to want to do as you lean into more AI development tools if you end up doing that. Now, of course, it's also a tool that every once in a while you make mistakes and you need to go back in time. Or maybe you decide that you want to change everything, and so you're going to go back from like a week ago's commit and then just remove everything you've been working on for a week, which is definitely something people do. Now, the way we did it is not always the most elegant, because if you are using force and reset hard, those two commands themselves might actually cause more problems than they're worth. So it's not always the recommended way to do it, but as a beginner, it's definitely the recommended way, so you don't have to spend too much time learning Git just yet. You want to learn Git when it becomes really, really critical to your workflow, that you don't make big, massive changes like I just did. But until that point, I think using reset and force are completely okay. And just as a reminder, what I mean by reset is this one right here. Reset with the git commit, ID, and then hard, and then force being the actual pushing force to override the Git repo itself, the remote repo itself. So a lot of reasons to use Git. The main ones, to summarize, are to share the code. Absolutely, that's number one. The second one is to keep track of changes over time so that we can unroll code or revert back to a previous state of that code, which I think is also very important. As you start building more and more software, you're going to start the process of running automated tests. Now, in the case of our Django project, that's a matter of running python manage.py test, and that will run all of your automated tests. Now, these tests we'll see a little bit of, but the idea here is making sure that your code actually runs before you try to deploy it into production. So doing it on your local machine makes a whole lot of sense. It also makes a whole lot of sense on doing it into GitHub. So GitHub itself has another tool called GitHub Actions. Now, Bitbucket and GitLab also have a tool like GitHub Actions that allow you to do something called CI/CD, or continuous integration and continuous delivery or deployment, depending on who you ask. But the idea here is CI/CD is the process, or part of the process of that is testing our code before we actually put it into production. So GitHub Actions helps us do that. Now, you don't have to use GitHub Actions itself. You can use those other solutions. You can also use something called Nectos Act, which will quite literally run your GitHub Actions workflows. Now, I want to use this very basically. We're not going to do super advanced GitHub Actions in here, but the nice thing is it can test your code, but it can also run your code on a schedule. So if you need a report sent every single day at a certain time, you can use GitHub Actions to do that. You don't need to deploy it anywhere else. There are some caveats to that, which would be like, hey, access to your database, for example. You need to make sure you have access to your database inside of GitHub Actions, which is something you can do and outside the scope of what we want to do right now. But I do want to show you this Getting Started with GitHub Actions page. We've got some suggestions for this repository. Now, GitHub itself already can recognize that we are using Django here. So I'm going to go ahead and hit configure, and I can see that it's building out a file for me for GitHub itself. And so if I scroll down here, I can see all of the different things that it might be doing, including a test itself. Hey, what do you know? That's the command I just showed you. Now, it's also showing these Python versions here. These are not valid versions that we would want to use. Instead, I'm going to use a string and do 3.13 because that's the only version I'm using. But the point here is we can actually change it as we see fit. I don't actually have to do much more than just this. So I'm going to go ahead and hit commit, and it's going to create this file. We're going to commit those changes. Right now, I just changed my code, but I changed it in GitHub itself. So there's new things on here. My local machine doesn't have those new things on there. So this is where sometimes doing that git reset comes to be a problem, because if you do something like this, you definitely still want to have this code. So do keep that in mind when you are doing stuff like git reset. In our case, we want to pull that code from GitHub, which we can do with just simply git pull. That will bring that code in here. Now, it doesn't actually make any changes, so if I do git push, nothing actually changed. I just made sure my local machine matched my remote machine. So git pull is kind of the opposite of git push. Hey, that's probably not that surprising. But the point here now is if we look at this workflow and we go through it, of course, we can actually run this right inside of VS Code as well, which is what it's trying to do. And in this case, of course, I'm using Cursor also, but this is based off of VS Code. Nevertheless, I'm not going to run it there. I'm just going to use GitHub to do it. One of the things, if we look into Django.yaml or YML, we scroll down a little bit, it says pip install requirements.txt. I don't actually have a file called requirements.txt. So if I go back into GitHub Actions, I can see that it actually did attempt to run, but it failed, right? So this is the failure of our code. It's tried to run the dependencies here, and then we get no such file requirements.txt. So this would prevent our code from being deployed. That's kind of the point. It did set up Python 3.13, but it did not finish the entire thing. So let's make sure that it can finish the entire thing by creating requirements.txt. So in here, I'm going to go ahead and add in requirements.txt. In our case, we want to make sure that we're using the correct versions of Django and all of our code. So if I do pip freeze here, I've got a few things in here that are a result of Django itself. So in my case, I'm going to go ahead and put in Django RC1 or release candidate 1. This is that pre-release in there. Yours hopefully will say Django itself, or you could even do something better by doing greater than or equal to 5.2.0 and then less than 5.3.0, which will get you the latest version of 5.2 in there. We'll come back to that later. For now, I want to go ahead and put in my release candidate in here, which is going to be equal to that right there. Okay, so with this in mind, I'll go ahead and do git status, and I'll go ahead and do git add -- all. We'll go ahead and do commit and added requirements.txt. Again, you could have done this in here as well, just by putting the message in, and then you can go ahead and sync those changes. And of course, that's going to now send it into GitHub, which is going to go ahead and run through the build process. Now, this one's going to fail as well. And the reason it's going to fail is because of the working directory that we've got. Now, the thing that doesn't fail is the requirements in here. It actually ran those requirements and installed everything because that's what we declared. The next thing that we see here is it can't run this because it's trying to run Django. This is so funny of a name, but it's trying to look for manage.py and it can't find that file inside of where it's running it. So looking back into our workflow here, this is running in our remote repository. It's running right next to where requirements.txt is, right? So we know that because pip install -r requirements.txt ended up working just fine. So it's looking inside of here for manage.py, which actually does not exist. That's in a completely different location. So this is where AI becomes really, really helpful. So if you were to grab this and do something like Command I, and then say something like, or let's go ahead and do Command L, or basically put this on a chat here and say, this is not working, and hit enter, which it will then go ahead and probably try to give you a better idea of what's going on. In this case, it doesn't. I think it's in the wrong folder. Maybe I want to move it to using something more like Claude Sonnet or something like that. But here we go. So we've got the working directory, your project. So right now the cursor stuff is not great. But the idea here is we actually want to add in a new key in here called working directory, in which case I'm going to go ahead and say src, which is the name of this folder here. So cursor 0, Justin 1. Okay, so nevertheless, we're going to go ahead and do git status here. And then once again, I'll just come back into cursor itself and say updated working dir and hit commit, yes. And then we'll go ahead and sync those changes like that. Okay, so I don't actually want to spend that much time on GitHub Actions. This right here is going to be a fundamental thing you'll be able to use in the future. But the idea here is we want to make sure that we can actually test our code every single time we send it to GitHub, which is exactly what the point of this is. So what it's going to do is, notice it actually did run the tests. Hey, what do you know? We don't have any errors in our tests, which means that it was successful, which is why we are now seeing it being successful itself. And so you can use this exact same workflow. There's a lot of them out there. We're not going to spend much more time on these workflows. I really just wanted to show you that there is a really powerful way to ensure our code is working as we intended inside of just GitHub directly. Whenever we push our code to GitHub, we want to pull out our secret keys to keep our secrets secret, right? They don't need to be on GitHub. Now, even if you're using a private repository, which I am, as you can see here, the code should still not have the keys in it. So now we need to talk about what to do instead. And it has everything to do with something called environment variables. Now, this is a very common way to manage your secrets using environment variables. So then when your application runs, those environment variables will become available at that time, at runtime. So this works with Django, it works with Fast API, it works with Node.js applications, Ruby on Rails. The idea of environment variables is incredibly common. So we'll continue to see this whenever you deploy software, whether it's Django or not. The way we do it in Django might be sort of Django specific, but in my case, I use this same methodology in all sorts of Python applications. So what we're going to do here now is really get these environment variables working. We see we've got a secret key, which of course is something we want to remain secret, so a value that we keep secret for security purposes. Then we also have a debug warning, which changes the mode that Django's in when it's running, which does make a big difference as well. So let's actually take a look at how we can go about this process and make these two values work. So as they stand right now, if we go into the root of our Django project and we run manage.py run server, we should get an error. So right away it says you must set allowed hosts if debug is false. So in other words, this is being interpreted as false. So if I change it to debug being true, in other words, this string value right here, and then run python manage.py run server, then it doesn't have that error anymore. So it quite literally changed the value of debug at runtime. But of course, the problem here is that we are exposing this still. So it's actually being called right on the command line. So if I actually were to open this up, I get another server error. This server error, if we scroll on down, we should see that it's related to the secret key. In other words, this environment variable is not set either. So let's go ahead and Control C out of the server, and now we can go ahead and add in this other environment variable for the secret key. So I actually changed the value inside of Django, the Python value and the environment variable value, to be different on purpose so that you have to remember, hey, we need to set it to something. So I'm going to say ABC123. Now I'm going to go ahead and run this server, and I'll refresh in here, and we're back to basically where we started, but the environment variables are no longer in the code. So this works fine for this small little test, but of course, this is still exposing those values inside of the terminal itself. We want to minimize any sort of environment variables being exposed. Now, the debug value, we could argue whether or not that should be exposed, but the secret key should definitely not be. So we need a better way on how to do this. And let's go ahead and take a look at what that is now. In the root of our project, right next to requirements.txt, we're going to create a new file that has a dot in front of it and then .env. This is a standard file name for environment variables on your local machine. There are things that are better. Something like HashiCorp Vault would be a better and more secure alternative to this on our local machine especially, but we're not going to do that. That goes a little bit more secure that I think a lot of projects probably need at this stage, especially if you're learning Django right now, or this is like one of the first times you've ever deployed it. You're probably not going to need something like HashiCorp Vault, but that is another way to do this process as well that locks it and secures it that much more. But we're going to use .env here. And so there are a number of ways to use a .env package or file. So the idea here is we want to get the environment variable itself, the name that we give it, which I'm going to go ahead and say ABC123 for a moment. And then I'm also going to put in Django debug. So I'm going to go ahead and change the other value to be just Django debug. So it's like that. Okay, great. So now I've got this env file and settings. Now I want to just go ahead and run it. Now, some web applications, you can actually just run the application like you were, and it would just work. It would just load those environment variables in. Django doesn't work that way. Now, if you use something like Next.js, that would work that way. That would actually load in .env for you. So that's actually a part that we need to add separate. This is very common in Python applications, that how you handle these environment variables are going to be separate. So with this in mind, I'm going to go ahead and make sure I save everything, and then we're going to jump into a couple of packages that you might consider using. One of them might be python.env. Now, this is not my favorite one to use, as I'll show you in just a moment, but you can use it. Go ahead and install it just like that. And then, of course, if you go into the documentation, we've got this right here, in which case you can go into settings.py, and right above OS, you can just go ahead and do something like that, and then you can go ahead and try to run your project again. Now it's running. So this is actually really nice because then we can use Python's default OS in itself, os.environ, and just kind of get some of those defaults from Python. You will see this in a lot of places because it's by far the most simple way to indicate that you're using environment variables is os.environ. But me personally, this is not my favorite way to use environment variables. I prefer Python decouple. So let's actually take a look at this now. And I'm going to put this one into requirements.txt. I'm going to close out my server, and I'll just do a pip install Python decouple. Now I'm going to go ahead and back into my settings. I could uninstall this if I wanted to. I'm just going to leave it out. Now I'm going to go ahead and do from decouple, we're going to import the config package or the config function here. And instead of using os.environ.git, I'm just going to do config. Now I can do something called a default value in here. This is really, really cool. I can also do this in the Django debug. This time I can do something a little bit different, and I can cast it to a specific data type. In this case, a Boolean value makes the most sense, and then our default value would be like true or false. Now, if I don't cast a value, a specific data type, you can infer it as a string. That's the default value that you would end up seeing in here, I believe. It might be any, but the point here is we can cast it to a specific value. So this is going to be a true false value altogether, which means that in my .env, I can put a 0 here for false or a 1 for true, or I can do a capital true. I think maybe even full-on capitalization true. The point is Python decouple helps us with that process. It will help us make that a little bit easier, as we'll see a little bit more as well. Now the Django secret key, this is another thing that you might want to set a default value for, because you do want to have your secret key running. So for this, I actually come in here and do from django.core.management.utils, I import the get random secret key function in here, which is actually used to set the initial one anyway. And so we can come in here and do something like that, which then I can go ahead and print out this secret key and I can run my application and I can see what the secret key ends up being with if there is a default. I could also go ahead and run the default itself at any time so that I can actually get my own secret key in here too. So if I print it out, notice that it runs it 2 times. I'm going to go ahead and grab one of these. We're going to go ahead and change our .env here, just like that. So we'll leave our settings, and now I'll go ahead and run this again. And what I will see is now that new secret key is our environment variable. So the reason I have this as a default is because then if I accidentally forget to add that environment variable, it will still at least have a pretty standard Django secret key itself, which is, I think, a good fallback to have based off of maybe your background right now. Every once in a while, like in my case, I actually don't put a default. I just let the project fail altogether. I let Django not even be built. But that's how I manage environment variables. So going forward, we put all of our settings for Django inside of settings.py. And if it's an environment variable setting, we load it in using Python decouples config with some default values if you have any in there. And then you can build out the rest of the environment variables. Before we jump in on the Django documentation, there is the deployment checklist that you might want to go through. Now, a lot of this series will be going through that checklist like what we're about to do, but every once in a while they add some new things in there so you'll learn how to make your deployment that much better and that much more secure. Now, one of the things we want to do now is actually test that security locally by changing Django debug to being 0. You don't want debug to ever be on in production, which is why our default for this setting should also just be false. Just keep it in as false. So if that environment variable is just simply not there, it's going to automatically say, hey, we don't want to be in debug mode for Django. So with this in mind, I'm going to go ahead and create a new terminal window here. I'm going to navigate into src and run python manage.py run server. So in the long run, we're not going to use run server to run our Django project, but in the short run, we see that it's already saying, hey, you need to set the setting of allowed hosts. Now, the reason I created a new terminal window was to ensure that config flushed old environment variables. Every once in a while, you might want to do that, especially with something like Django debug itself. And every once in a while, your secret keys and stuff like that might need to be flushed as well, which I just created a new terminal window for that and rerun our Django server. So with this in mind, we now need to set the allowed hosts. So the question, of course, is what is an allowed host? What does that mean exactly? Well, it has everything to do with your domain name. Let's say, for instance, you own hungrypie.com, which I do, which I'll be using soon. But the idea here is we want this to be our Django project's domain name. So I'm going to go ahead and save it like this. Now I'm going to go ahead and run the server. Great, things are looking pretty good. I realize it says something about migrations. We'll talk about that later. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and open up my local host and I get bad request. Well, this has everything to do with the fact that I'm not accessing this, URL or this actual Django project from the domain of HungryPie. So Django itself has built-in mechanisms to ensure that the correct domain is accessing the correct Django project. Now, that also means that there is something called cores that we need to look at later. This is going to be for API type requests or cross-origin request sharing, but that's not what we're talking about here. We're really just talking about the Django project itself. What is it using, or how is it actually being able to be run? Okay, so in debug mode, we can say something like this. So we can say if debug, then we can go ahead and say or override the allowed hosts to being the list of just star. This means that it's going to allow every host that's ever been inside of our Django project, which might be what you want to do in debug. So with debug, you might also can just leave this empty. But of course, I'm going to leave it as star just for the moment. Now, the thing is, though, what allowed host does this actually support? Well, it only does that one. So if we do the subdomain of www, you would also want to have that in there as well. You need to be explicit about all of the subdomains in there. Now there is something called a wildcard, which you can just get rid of that and put a dot in front of it, and then it's dot whatever that value is as well. So that's actually pretty nice. You can do both of these things. Now we're going to be deploying to Railway, and we won't know what our subdomain is, so we're going to go ahead and do railway.app as a dot for now. These ones I'll come back to in the future, so I'm going to leave them commented out. But the idea is this is kind of a catch-all that we want to use. Now, in conjunction with allowed hosts, there's a somewhat newer setting to Django called CSRF_trusted origins. Now, if you're not familiar with CSRF inside of Django, this is cross-site request forgery. This means that when you are making a post request from a form, which we'll see soon too, you want to make sure that you have the trusted origin in there, which would be this domain itself, or just like the allowed hosts, but this time it's going to actually have the protocol that's in there, and you also want to put the actual star for your wildcard. So you're going to use those two things in conjunction with one another once we go in production itself. So once we actually have those things and we do our run server here, on debug mode, we still have a bad request. When we go into production mode, which of course is going to turn debug mode off, then we would want to reset this. And like I said before, you might need to clear out your cache for the actual environment variables. So we just close out that terminal, clear things out, and we're back in business in terms of the allowed hosts being available. We're now going to create a hello world view and template so that when we actually do deploy this, we will see something other than a Django error. So what we want to do here is take this base directory and declare a few other directories in here. So if you're not familiar with pathlib, which is built into Python, you can take a look at it like this. So if I were to run my server here, I should be able to see the actual folder that I'm working in, which is not that surprising. Yours is going to look different. The nice thing about pathlib is it is cross-platform, as in Mac will look like this, Windows will look like this, and so on. So it doesn't matter what system you're on, these paths resolve really well. This right here gets the absolute path to settings.py. The parent of that is the CFE home, the main configuration module folder. The parent of that, of course, is src, the root of the Django project. So baster is used for a lot of things. That is one of them. And so what I also do sometimes is I'll come in here and say repo dir, which is the base directory.parent. And then I also come in here and do something like templates dir, and this is going to be the base directory again, and then /templates. Okay. So this allows me to use templates, use Django templates inside of my project once I actually configure it correctly. But the nice thing about this is I can print out each one of these just to verify that the paths are correct. And so once I do that, I save it. I can see all of these different paths here. Now, in the case of the templates directory, if I wanted to see if it exists, this is what pathlib is really good for, is you can do template directory exists like that. And in my case, it's going to go ahead and say false to start out. You can also then do mkdir, and you can say parents being true, exists okay being true, and that will actually create the folder for you. You might have noticed right there, and in which case we now have that template directory. Now, every once in a while, you might want to do this make dirs here if you end up using it, if it's a requirement for your project, which in our case, it is a requirement for our project. But if our templates aren't in there, then we should see errors anyway. But nevertheless, I'm going to go ahead and use that templates dir inside of the templates folder here. I normally don't write it out this way. I normally just go ahead and say baster /templates. And I don't really worry about creating that folder because it's so fundamental. I use it all of the time. But nevertheless, I'm going to go ahead and come back in here and bring in our templates dir here. It looks like I accidentally undid something here. I don't want manage.py anymore. Okay, so now we've got our templates dir in here that we can work off of. Inside of that, I'm going to go ahead and just do hello world.html For this hello world.html, I'm just going into tailwindcss.com under their CDN, and I'm just going to go ahead and copy this CDN version of Hello World for Tailwind. There's a lot more things that we could do in here in terms of HTML. The point of this series is not to build out a bunch of HTML, but rather to just have some of the Django stuff working itself. So with this in mind, I'm going to go into CFE Home here, and I'm going to create views.py. For those of you who do not know about views.py or templates, this might not be the series for you. Nevertheless, we'll go ahead and keep going from Django, and I want to go ahead and bring in shortcuts. We're going to import something called render, and then I'm going to define the hello world function here, which will be a request, and we'll return render, and I'm going to return our request, and then our new template of hello world.html with empty context. Now, what I'm also going to bring in here is going to be something like from Django.http. We'll import HTTP response, and I'm going to go ahead and say something like my health view or health check view. And all this is going to do is return an HTTP response of OK. Great. So now with these two views here, I'm going to bring them into my URLs. I'm going to get rid of these comments. We don't need those anymore. And then I'm going to go ahead and do from dot import views. On my home page, I'll do that hello world, which will just be an empty string here. And then we'll do views dot hello world. And then on our health check, we will bring that one in as well, which is going to be health Z with a trailing slash. And this is going to be our health view. So health check views are very common. We'll see this in a little bit, but it's basically to ensure that our application is running. It's a very small view, doesn't do a whole lot. It's just an easy, simple way to ping our website to see that it's running. So of course we could test these out by running our server. Looks like it's still running here, so I'm gonna go ahead and open it up. There's my hello world. Great, that looks good. And then my health check view, health, there's the OK. Whenever we run python manage.py run server, we see that it is a development server and not to use it in production, but use WSGI or ASGI instead. So those files actually already exist. If we look at our main Django project configuration, we can see that there's settings.py, of course, but then we also see that there's WSGI.py and ASGI.py. Let's take a look at WSGI.py first and really talk about what this is. This stands for Web Server Gateway Interface. What we're going to end up using for this one is called Gunicorn. Gunicorn itself has been around for a long time. It's fast, and it's a production-ready gateway server, basically a production-ready WSGI. Now, Django has been using Gunicorn for a long time for production, and it's been doing this before there was support for asynchronous functions in Python. So if you go back into our views here, these are all synchronous functions. As soon as you want to use asynchronous functions inside of Python, whether it's a Django view or not, then what you're going to end up doing is using the ASGI, the asynchronous web server gateway interface, altogether. And of course, the actual files themselves are not a whole lot different. But of course, if you were to open up the ASGI stuff, you will see that it says you can use Daphne, Hypercorn, or Uviacorn. Personally, I like using Uviacorn because Uviacorn and Gunicorn work really well together. And every time I need to deploy FastAPI, which is another Python web framework like Django, I use basically the same commands. And this is true for deployment as well. So I typically do not use asynchronous Django unless I really have to. There hasn't been a strong need for me to use it, but it's important to understand that there is a difference in the runtime, or at least the production server, when you go through that process. So I actually want to just look at the synchronous version, the standard version for Django, which is going to be the WSGI server itself. If you want to see more advanced stuff in terms of asynchronous, please let me know in the comments. But for right now, we're going to go ahead and take a look at how to use the Gunicorn itself, and just Gunicorn. So the idea here is we're just looking at the baseline on how we can use Gunicorn, not the production one just yet. But the idea is we want to do pip install Gunicorn here. Now, of course, if you install Gunicorn this way, you also want to put it in requirements.txt. This is really important for production, of course. But the idea is now that we've got Gunicorn, we just need to navigate into SRC, and then we run Gunicorn. we run the actual Python module, which is going to be CFE home, and then it's the WSGI. So CFE home dot WSGI colon. That colon is going to look for the application itself, which is that. And then we just do bind, and we're going to bind it to our local host, which is going to be at port 8000. This will come into play a lot more later. We run that. We now have a production-ready server, web server gateway interface that can run our Django project. And of course, we can open this URL up now, and we still see hello world. Notice all of the warnings that Django was giving us before are not there. And it also isn't saying that there's already a port running or a Django project running at port 8000. So let's close both of these out with Control-C. And let's just change the port to ensure that that one actually runs. And sure enough, it does. Great. So it's possible that if we ran this incorrectly, our previous server, our development server, was actually running not our Gunicorn one. But of course, if we go into Gunicorn itself, let's go ahead and open that up again and refresh a few times. We're not necessarily seeing all the logs from it like you would in the Django project, where if you were to run Django itself, refresh a few times, you would see all of the logs right in line. Gunicorn is not necessarily going to show those by default. Yes, of course, there's a way to configure it to make sure that it does, but this baseline configuration does not do that. Great. So now that we've got Gunicorn, or at least the fundamentals of using Gunicorn down, we want to actually deploy this. Let's take a look. Let's go ahead and deploy our code from GitHub to Railway. Now, if you use this link right here to sign up for Railway, it gives me credit and basically lets them know, hey, we should make a lot more tutorials together. Of course, you could also just go to railway.com directly and sign up there. Feel free to choose what you like. Now, this deployment process is shortcutted by using djangocontainer.com, which has all of the things necessary to deploy right now. But of course, that's not actually using the code we've been working on. We want to use the code we've been working on, in which case we're going to do that right now, at least the first one. So let's go ahead and sign into our account, or create one if you don't have one. We're going to go ahead and continue with GitHub, which I'm going to be using my tutorial account, not my real one. And I'm just going to go ahead and sign up. Notice this process. We're going to go ahead and authorize Railway itself, which would then allow me to log in to my account. Now, I already have an account here, so it shows that information, but feel free to go through the necessary steps to make this work. And we should be able to use the hobby account for this for some duration, for at least learning all of this stuff. So what we want to do here is we want to go ahead and say new, and we want to use our own GitHub repo here. So we're going to go ahead and configure our GitHub app. I'm going to open this up again using that same tutorial user, and then I want to use only select repositories. I'm going to show you how you can change this value in just a moment, but I'm going to go ahead and do only select repositories. And of course, I'm going to search to Django, which should be deploy Django, but there was a typo. Anyways, we've got install and authorize then, and this should take us back into Railway itself, which of course it opens it up here, but we can also do it inside of that other window itself. And then we can go into new project, and there's Django there, and I can go ahead and deploy this. So while that's working, it's definitely going to fail. I'll explain why later. Well, it might succeed, but it will probably fail. Now, if we actually go back into GitHub, if we want to modify our allowed applications or repos, we can go into GitHub and we can jump into our settings here. And then inside of the settings, we scroll on down to applications. Inside of here, we can see installed GitHub apps. We can also see authorized GitHub apps, which of course is our OAuth stuff. This is how we actually were able to log in. And then we can see authorized OAuth apps, which is just the GitHub CLI. So the authorized GitHub app is this one. This is how we log in. The installed app is the one that actually allows for our various repos. So there's two things that get added to your GitHub account related to Railway. So if you go into configure here, you can then see, oh, I can just grant all repository access, or I can add each one individually if I'd like. You will have to grant access for Railway to be able to do its thing, which in this case, it's going to try to build a deployment image, a container image. We're going to have to talk about this in a little bit, but notice that it does fail. So we can actually take a look at the logs as to why it failed, and it's got a no start command can be found. So naturally, we're going to need to add a start command of some kind. I'm going to go ahead and just do my best guess at this point based off of what we just did with Gunicorn. And that's going to be cd src and gunicorn cfehome.wsgi : application and then bind 000.0 and port 8000, or let's do port 8080 just to make sure we know that port. Okay, so the key here is that we have a bind. 000 is important at this time. We will look at other kinds of host values here, but we'll use 000 across the board with 8080 in there. I'm going to go ahead and deploy this one now. It's certainly possible that this will also not work. So we'll see. We'll do the deployment and we'll go through this process. I let it finish deploying, which took about a minute, and notice that it says crashed here. So it actually did not deploy. It gets this Gunicorn command not found in here. Now, if we look in the build logs, we should be able to see all of the different things that maybe were installed or maybe not. We see that Django's in here. I have Django all across the board, but I don't necessarily see Gunicorn being installed. So let me go back to my local project. Notice that I've got a 4 here. I actually haven't updated my GitHub repo. I could also verify this by going into that repo. So let's go ahead and take a look at that repo itself. And we can see in here, requirements.txt only has Django itself. So of course I need to sync these things. I need to make sure all of the requirements are in place. Otherwise it won't actually build. It won't create our project. I'll talk about the build and deploy stuff in a little bit, but for now I want to actually at least sync the code changes and see what happens. So the important part here is it will actually sync it to GitHub. GitHub itself will run a GitHub action workflow based off of the Gunicorn stuff that we just talked about, which has mostly the requirements.txt. So GitHub's doing its own thing here. Railway at the exact same time is running the deployment process. So it's going to build something called a container image, then it's going to deploy that container image. Both things we'll talk about still, but what it says right here is it's starting this container. It's looking like it's actually working in here. And so that's actually a fairly straightforward process if we remember what our build command is to run it, that is. So back into our settings, when we go to that deploy, that start command here, that is one thing we have to remember. And we also have to remember to have our latest code on there, which would include Gunicorn in our requirements.txt, which is pretty great. But now with it deployed, as it says, I can go into networking here and generate a domain name, which should give us a Railway domain name. One thing we're going to have to check is the extension. The very end is railway.app. We need to make sure that whatever that says, which could change in the future, is the same as what we have on our allowed hosts in both places. If it's not the same, then it won't work correctly. Notice the port is 8080. Hey, what do you know? That is the same port value I put right here. That is also possible to be changed. Don't worry, we will absolutely go through this process and we'll do some customization, an additional customization a little bit. So even if this is kind of fast, I just wanted to give you a high level overview as to how to deploy. But there we go. We got our hello world already. So in a matter of minutes with the correct code, we were actually able to deploy successfully. So the original deployments, the first two that failed because I didn't provide all of the correct code during the build process, which I think is a very important step that we want to make sure that we use. So from here on out, what we can do to make changes is, well, go back into our local project, and I'm going to go into my hello world template here, and I'm going to go ahead and say deployed, ! Save that. We'll go ahead and do our, hey, I deployed as a message. We'll commit it. We'll say yes. We'll sync those changes. We'll say okay. This will go into GitHub. GitHub's going to do its thing, but if we look into Railway, we will see our deployments in here come up in just a moment. Notice that it's initializing the deployment, and then here it is. Hey, I deployed, and then you can see the build logs, the deploy logs, and then eventually the HTTP logs. And so this process is, well, I mean, in this case, it took 8 seconds, which was not very, very long to actually build the container and then deploy it. Okay, great. And so there it is. Hey, I deployed. We can refresh our home page. There it is, deployed. It's going to be that simple. Railway has a really compelling way to manage environment variables for your applications. In this part, we're going to take a look at some of the basics for that. So if you go into the Railway dashboard here, we're going to click on our project, and then we're going to go ahead and click on our service that's running. Now, each project in Railway can have multiple services, which is where these variables start to get really interesting and really compelling. But the idea here is inside of our project, we're going to go ahead and add a new variable here, and we're just going to call this Django debug, and we'll go ahead and say 0. And then I'll go ahead and add it. As soon as I add it, it's attempting to make a change, which says deploy. This means that it's going to go ahead and rebuild our application and then deploy it as well. So if we look at our deployments here, we will see that process happening from our most recent commit. So it's not changing the code at all. It's just rebuilding the container image. More on that soon. But until we get there, let's actually take a look at how we might change our environment variables or how we might use them in our project directly from scratch. So inside of .env, I'm going to go ahead and set a new environment variable, which I'm just going to go ahead and say project name, and I'm going to call this Django, right? So we're going to go ahead and use that as our project name throughout. Now, of course, this is meant to be a placeholder for real variables that you might use, like API keys or something like that. But the idea here is we've got this project name. I'm going to go ahead and load it into settings.py. Whenever you want to use an environment variable, it should go into settings.py as the first configuration or the primary configuration. So in other words, we've got secret key and debug in here for a reason, but the settings module, settings.py, should have all of your environment variables by default. Okay, so what we've got here is the project name, which we'll take in config of that project name, and we'll do a default and say, unset project name. There we go. Okay, so now that I've got this configured, I'm going to go ahead and use it. So I inject it into settings.py, and then to use it, we go into like a view, for example, and we bring in the settings module here. So from django.conf, we're going to import settings. Now we're going to go ahead and say something like the project name equals to get attribute settings dot, or rather not dot, but comma, project name. And then we can have a default in here saying like inline views or unset project views. There we go. And so with this project name, then I can bring it into a view context and say something like project name like that. And we really just want the value right there. As soon as we do that, we can then open up our template and we can use that context project underscore name. Now I lowercased it on purpose because this is the context value that we're passing into the context dictionary here versus the settings value or the constant value of project name. Okay, great. So I now have the variable being injected locally. So let's go ahead and try this thing out. Let's go into our SRC here. We'll run our server. Let's just make sure it works locally before I go anywhere. It looks like I already have a server running. Let me close that one out and I'll run it again. And we'll open this up. And now I've got Django deployed. So project name, and I'll just call this, instead of deployed, I'll go ahead and say project, just to give it a little bit of variance from what we had before. Okay, now that we've got that, let's go ahead and push this. So updated project name and var, something like that. Hit commit, say yes, sync those changes, say okay. And of course, this goes into to GitHub itself, and then GitHub's going to do its thing. And then in Railway, we should see a deployment going through, which will take a minute or so to build out based off of the minimum Django project we do have. Now, it's important to note that Railway itself, these environment variables, work at two different times, during the building phase and during the deploying phase. For those of you who are very familiar with Docker and building Docker container images, this should be really exciting to you. It was for me, but the idea here is we don't need to worry about the building and deploying just yet. We'll talk about that soon enough. But now in 30 seconds, we have a updated project. I'm going to go ahead and open it up. Now it says unset project name. Slightly different than our local one, but definitely along the same lines. And it's coming from our setting value in here. And of course, our views. The reason this default didn't show up is because settings.py has that attribute. It's actually in there, except the environment variable is not. So now we can actually bring in our environment variable. There's two ways on how we can do this. We can do this at a project level with a shared environment variable by doing something like that. That's outside the scope of what we're doing just yet, but it's kind of nice that there is project level ones so we can have shared environment variables when we want to. We're going to stick with the service level environment variable by going into variables here, click on variable, add in the project name. Now we're going to go ahead and do our Railway Django or something like that. We'll go ahead and add that in, go ahead and deploy it. And of course, that's going to take a minute or so for that to finish up deploying with the new environment variable. I'll let it actually finish up. Okay, 35 seconds or so, it finished up deploying. We refresh in here. There is our now injected environment variable on this particular service. Pretty great, very straightforward in terms of how we can use our environment variables. The other nice thing about this is there's this raw editor here. If for whatever reason we ever needed to copy an entire .env file, you could do so with that paste statement. Now, in the case of the Django secret key, it actually makes sense to also have that one in there as well, because you don't actually want to generate a brand new secret key every single time Django is deployed. You want to use the same one. And of course, I don't actually have quotes in here, so let's go ahead and update it. Let's see if it actually adds those quotes for me, and it sure enough does. That's pretty cool. Okay, so I can go ahead and deploy that and just pretty much call that what it is, which is environment variables working well in production, and it was really just that simple. One of the core parts of Django is how it integrates with databases out of the box, the Django ORM. So we actually have seen this with our manage.py run server command. We've got 18 unapplied migrations. Now, this is going to be true in production as well because we haven't been migrating the database. And of course, if I were to migrate it locally, it's as simple as navigating into SRC and then running Python manage.py migrate. You hit enter, and that creates a db.sqlite file. As you may know, it is grayed out. It is going to be ignored by Git. This will not be pushed into production at all. So what we need to do, though, is on our production side, we need to run that migrate command. Now, there's also a flag in here that you can use called no input. If you hit enter, it will just run it. It won't ask for any input whatsoever. So this is the actual command we want to run in production. So to do this, what we're going to do is jump into Railway, of course, and go into our settings here, click on deploy, and then see that there is this add pre-deploy step. So in between the build and deploy, we can go ahead and do cd src and python manage.py and migrate, and then do something like -- no input. Notice that there's the and there to chain these commands together. So if we wanted to do another command after this, we totally could. So I'm going to go ahead and save that, and then we'll go ahead and deploy this. So the point of this, though, is really just to be able to run that migrate command before we actually integrate a production grade database like a Postgres database, whether it's one that is coming directly inside of Railway or it's coming from an external host. But the point here is we can actually build out the container and then run that command. Now, the other nice thing about this is maybe in your post build command, like pre-deploy, what you can see in our deploy logs, there's all of the migrations happening. Maybe one of the things you also want to do in here is use something like python manage.py send test email to the admins just to make sure that it is built, or you can build out your own custom management command to make sure all of that's working. Now, we're not going to do that right now. The main thing here was really to see how we run those migrations and where we could do it. So there it is. All of those migrations are up and running. And of course, now we need to do something related to the Django admin. So we'll be able to log into that. And eventually we'll have to figure out how to make it look correct as well. Let's add in a Postgres database from Railway. So inside of our Railway project, we're going to go ahead and provision a Postgres SQL database. So this will take a moment for it to be fully provisioned, but the idea here is it will have a bunch of different variables available to us. One of them is the public database URL here. So this is something that we might want to use on our local machine just to get stuff working. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this right now. I'm going to jump back into my project, and we'll go ahead and do in .env. We're going to go ahead and add in database and _ URL. and we're going to go ahead and set that value, whatever it ends up being. Yours is probably going to be a little bit different than this, but that's the point. We want to set that value, and of course, if it ends up changing when it's fully deployed, then just go ahead and copy whatever that value might end up being. Great. So now we've got a publicly accessible database that we can use. So let's actually sync up or connect our Django project to it. So inside of our requirements, we want to add in DJ database URL. We also want to add in scopg binary. This is the Postgres like Python connection version 3. There is also scop binary 2, which I believe is scop2 binary, something like that. But the idea here is we want to use the newest one, which is of course version 3. I think both of them will probably work even for current versions of Django, but I want to use the newest one, so I'll go ahead and stick with that. So with this in mind, now that I've got these things in my requirements, I'll go ahead and do my pip install, and we'll do r and requirements.txt, hit enter, and it should install everything. If for some reason the scopg binary doesn't install, you might need to install other things on your system, especially if you're on Linux itself. But actually doing that installation is outside the process or point of this one. But nevertheless, we've got a database URL that we can now try to use locally. So inside of settings.py here, I'm going to scroll down to my database setting, which is this, and I'll go ahead and do database URL equals to config of that database URL. I'm going to cast it as an str, and then I'm going to put the default as an empty string so that basically I can say if the database URL exists, then I'll go ahead and import DJ database URL, in which case I'll go ahead and now say something like the databases, this right here, equals to, well, we're going to go ahead and put in our default still, so we're overriding the default, and this is going to be DJ database URL dot config, and then the default here is going to be that database URL like that. And then you can add in other configuration items if you want to. I'm just going to go ahead and bring in just those. Now, one of the other things that you might want to check inside of the database URL itself is basically if it starts with these two things, Postgres or Postgres SQL, then you can go ahead and set that. This is a little bit different than something like SQL model, which is what you would use in FastAPI, the way these are connection strings end up working. In other words, if you're using SQL model, you might see something more like plus the scopg, like that. Okay, so with this in mind, we now have our database. Let's see if we can migrate it locally. So I'm going to go ahead and run python manage.py migrate. This, in theory, would connect to an external database into Railway, right? Which is super nice. So this might be our Postgres dev version, right? So we can just leave this off to the side. Maybe we use it, maybe we don't. The point here is we have the ability to use now a production version of Postgres. Now, I would also say that it would be a good idea to get Docker on your local machine so that you can use Docker Compose and a containerized version of Postgres locally. Typically speaking, when I'm using a development environment, I don't have a actual production database associated or connected to it all of the time. Most of the time I'm using Docker Compose, but we're not going to do that in this one. I just wanted to show you what you would end up doing if you wanted to use a development version of Postgres itself. So now that we have the code in place, though, we can actually deploy this and put it into production elsewhere. So I'm going to go ahead and add all these things in. We're going to go ahead and commit it and add DJ or database URL, and then I'll go ahead and push it. Now, of course, I could have done all that right in here, but I just wanted to show you that quick step. Now we're going to go ahead and create another Postgres database in here. This one, of course, is going to be our production one. Okay, so this time I'll just rename it to Postgres-prod, just like that. And of course, once again, what we'll see very soon are some variables. The production database, though, I do not want it to have a public URL. So inside of networking here, I want to go ahead and delete that public networking. I don't want it at all. I only want it to be private networking. So what we see here then is the private networking connection. So really the question becomes, how do we actually connect these two things to each other? Well, there's a few different ways on how we can consider doing it. The easiest way to do it is by going into our Django project, hitting on variables here, going in and adding a new variable, which is going to be database URL. And notice that we've got a few options for Postgres. We've got Postgres dev and Postgres prod. That's the one I'm going to end up using, and we're going to go ahead and add that one. Now, off the video, I did test this a little bit, so I'm going to go ahead and override the one I have here, and then I'm going to go ahead and let that deployment process start. And so that's going to take a moment for that to be fully deployed, but what ends up happening, of course, once it is deployed, it should run our deployment command of migrate. In other words, it should actually prepare our production Django database project with the Postgres production database, right? So both things should now be in place once it's all said and done and all the deployment options are up. Now, one of the things about the variables is we can take a look at the variables themselves. Inside of here, we should see something like this: Postgres-prod Railway internal. That actual endpoint is showing us that it's using the internal network. It's not using a public networking thing like we saw before. So it's using this actual DNS name versus what we did locally, which was using the actual Railway API endpoint for this actual database itself, or that production DNS server that is using and forwarding the request directly to the development version. But with this in mind, I'm going to go ahead and take a look. It looks like the database URL was built, and it looks like it should have migrated. So we've got all of these migrations in here. So now we have our Django project up and going. So let's go ahead and jump into the admin here. So what I'm hoping we see here when we try to log in is just saying that we don't have any access to it, right? We shouldn't have a 500 error here. It should just be saying, add the correct username and password. Now, why is it that we don't have a username and password? Well, of course, we didn't actually create a admin user just yet. So before we create the admin user, here's a couple of options on how we could create it with our local project. The first option, probably the easiest option, would be going back into Postgres prod, into settings, and temporarily allow for a public networking site in here. So you can go ahead and regenerate a domain here. This domain then I could go ahead and use and then create an admin user on my local machine and then take off that domain again and call it a day. Or we could go to the next step, which makes it a little bit more flexible for redeploying a Django project, which would be using a Django management command, which is exactly what we're going to do here very soon. But the idea here is you now have a production database and it spins up in seconds, and you can also delete these things really quickly. So you just come in here in settings, danger, and then you can go ahead and delete the service if you want to delete it. And then you would do something like apply destructive changes, just like that, and it'll go through the delete process. Notice that there is a volume in here that was associated to that we also want to delete as well. So feel free to delete that one too and apply those destructive changes. So feel free to use the production Postgres as you see fit on your local machine in this development environment, or in our case, we're just going to be focusing on having Postgres just in production itself. Now we're going to create a Django management command to automatically create a Django admin user. Now, what you may see in my.env are two keys that you may or may not have at this point. I'm going to remove both of them because I'm not going to be using the Postgres database locally right now. What I'm going to do though is I'm going to jump into djangocontainer.com, scroll on down a little bit to the code for Django container, open that up into a new tab, go into SRC, into commando, into management, into commands, into auto admin. This is what we're going to implement right now so that we can automatically create a Django admin user. I realize that you can absolutely bring in a database URL locally and create it all locally, but I want to make it easier to deploy this more frequently and just have it create an admin user for me, which is exactly what I'm doing. Okay, so with this in mind, I'm going to go ahead and start a new terminal window here, and we're going to jump into the SRC. We're going to do Python manage.py, start app, and we're going to call it commando. And since we created a new Django app, we're going to jump into settings.py, scroll on up to installed apps, and bring in commando here as well. So with this in mind, the commando app is where we're going to go ahead and put this management command. Of course, if you're on the GitHub repo itself, you can just copy the path here, click right next to requirements.txt, hit new file, paste in that path, hit enter, and it'll actually create the correct path for you. it's nice that Cursor, VS Code, Windsurf, they all do that same exact thing. So inside of Commando, inside of management specifically, I want to bring in an init file there. Inside of commands, I want to do the same thing, just to make sure that these are all Python modules. Next up, I'm going to go back into the code and I'm going to just copy this raw file, and we're going to go ahead and paste it, not in the terminal, but rather inside of the code file itself, and autoadmin.py. There we go. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and run this. Now, one of the things you'll notice is I'm importing config from a module called helpers. I'm actually using Python decouple there. It's just imported a little different on that repository that we just looked at. So I'm going to go ahead and bring in decouple just right now. Now you might recall I said before when we brought it into views to use Django settings and Django settings.py. The only reason I'm not doing that is because you may or may not use this file itself, but every once in a while you might want to have configuration that is set one time. So in our case, this is only going to run really one time on our production database. So I'm not really going to need this command in the near future, but I will need the environment variables that come from it, like the Django admin password. Now, the other important part about this is I don't really want to have a Django admin password configuration on my settings either. This is definitely something I want to avoid because every once in a while, the settings itself might actually have some sort of output. So sometimes with debug, you might end up seeing that as well. In other words, I'm just going to leave it in here as Python decouple. So now that we've got this, we want to actually set a Django admin password somewhere. But before I actually set it, let's go ahead and jump into our SRC. We'll run python manage.py, hit enter, scroll on up. I should see under commando, I should see auto admin. If I don't, that means I have the paths incorrect, which those are the paths right there. But now that I've got that, I should be able to do the auto admin here and hit enter, and I've got Superuser already exists. So I did some tests here, so I'm going to go ahead and delete my database and now go ahead and run Migrate again for deleting the SQL database, and then run auto admin, and there it goes. It goes and creates a user for me with the password of admin. That password of admin is not very good, so let's go ahead and create a better one. First off, I'll migrate the database here, and then I'll go ahead and do open SSL rand-base 6432. Now, 32 is the number of characters here, which kind of gives you that. But the idea here is OpenSSL is a really good way to create passwords. There's many other ways. Feel free to look at them. You could also use the get random secret key as well. That will create another one for you like we saw before. So now that I've got this idea here, I'm going to go ahead and bring it in to my Django admin password. We're going to bring it into .env here. We will paste that one in, and then I'll go ahead and say equals to that value. And now we're going to go ahead and run our python manage.py, auto admin, hit enter. Now it's creating that user with that password. Notice it does output this inside of the terminal. So this is mostly a one-off password that we should change right away, which we'll see when we actually push this into production. But the point here is we now have a new command in here to create this user. So I'll go ahead and do git status. Notice that I've got commando in there and my settings changed a little bit. I'll go ahead and say added auto admin, and we'll go ahead and commit that. And yes, then we'll sync those changes. And now we'll go ahead and take this admin password here. Let's go ahead and copy that, and we'll bring it into our variables, add new variable, paste it in. Notice that I pasted in the entire string here with the equals, and it added it to my environment variables, which I'll go ahead and deploy. Now I'll also jump into my settings of deploy and run, and in python manage.py, auto admin, hit check, and deploy that as well. I let that finish deploying for a few moments, and I want to grab the variable for the admin password. And then of course we're going to go ahead and open up our project here, jump into the admin itself, type out the admin user and password, go ahead and hit in, and then you should be able to log into the Django admin, which is very straightforward. And of course, the actual database is storing all that information. Now, what you would probably see if you tried to just use SQLite, as in if you went to the process of not using a production database, you're probably not going to be able to log into the admin at all. And you could totally try that by removing the variable of the database URL and try to actually log in. It probably won't let you. It probably won't do anything. I think a big part of the reason for that is the pre-deploy commands here. These are being run before we actually deploy our container, which I think they're actually ran in their own container, like a small little container where it just runs it, and then it'll run a new container with this different command. This is where understanding how containers work make a big difference. They are ephemeral. They will be deleted constantly. That's actually what's happening when we push our code. We are creating a new container and we're running that container. All of the old ones are being deleted. So if you ever try to store files, for example, from a Django project, you want to store that in next to your Django stuff inside of a runtime application. It's probably not going to work unless you actually attach a volume to it, like what we see in our Postgres database that has a volume that is a persistent volume so that it would actually persist. The data would stay there. Our Django containers do not do that. These will actually be deployed, deleted, rebuild it, and all that. So I'm pretty sure that this deploy command happens on another container. So if you were to try to migrate a SQLite database, more than likely you create it and then a brand new container is going to be ran again, which would delete it. In other words, what you could potentially do if you really wanted to use SQLite, you could probably do something like this. I definitely don't recommend it, but it's just something to think about in terms of, rapid testing and all that of your Django project. Overall, I think these steps are fairly straightforward and really effective. Now, of course, we need to solve the static files issues where our Django admin does not have any of the styles that it should have in production. We want to configure Django for our static files so that we can actually manage them correctly. Now, if we look at our local project in admin, we can see that it looks polished. If we look at our production one in admin, we can see that it looks broken. This has to do with the static files. And so if we look at the production one, inspect the element under network, maybe refresh the page, you can see that there's a bunch of 404 errors in here, and that's because these files are not found. If we do that same thing on our local project, and go into the network, refresh in there, we can see that we're getting 200 across the board. So the question is, how do we actually bring these CSS files into production? Now, these are all called static files. So any file that doesn't change when the runtime starts is going to be considered a static file. Of course, if it's not a Python file or an HTML file, a template file that is actually serving the project itself. So anything else, images, JavaScript, CSS, videos, PDFs, you can consider all of those things to be static files. They don't change during runtime. They might change later, but they're static during runtime. Okay, so obviously the Python files don't change during runtime either, but those ones actually serve the project itself. The static files do not. These are ones that can be hosted pretty much anywhere in the world. If you think about it, an image that your Django project wants to load, you can have it load from within Django, or you can have it load from somewhere else. That's also another defining characteristic of these static files too. Whereas your Python files cannot be loaded somewhere else. They just wouldn't work correctly and probably would be incredibly inefficient and insecure, which is really interesting, and we'll come back to that within the static files themselves. So in order for us to actually push these static files into production, we have to understand how to handle them on our local project. So if we go into settings.py and we scroll all the way down to static, we need to set up two primary directories in here. One is going to be something called a static root directory. The other one is going to be something called a static files dir list. So the static root directory is going to be where we send files. So we send our static files here, and then this is where we kind of retain a copy of static files here, like custom CSS, for example. So if you are going to add in your own custom CSS file, you would put it in the static files dir, or basically where all of these files might exist. So for example, let's go ahead and focus in on the static files dir first. Inside of SRC here, if I went ahead and did a new folder and I wanted to call it UX, right? And inside of this UX, I'm going to go ahead and do custom.css and said body and color is red, right? So in this case, we've got UX in here. This is then going to be a folder that we want to add into the static files dir, which would be base dir /UX, and that would be that entire folder. That is kind of the custom place that we're going to put it. Now, I typically would not call it UX. You'll see what I call it in just a moment. Now, the question is, where do we put it? This is a copy of the in progress files that we probably end up changing. The static files, these are kind of like locked files that do not change during runtime, right? And so these are unlocked files down here. Then we can call these unlocked files that change during dev. That's it. Okay. So this distinction is important for how you manage these things. So if you were to put in custom files, custom images, all of those are going to go into one of these static files dir. Now some apps have their own static files dirs, which becomes really obvious when we actually set our static root. You could also think of this as an external static file server. You could think of it that way as well. Now, when it comes to deploying this into production, we often have these folders in the same project itself, inside of SRC itself, which of course, that's why you see UX is in here. Now, if I come in here and I'm going to go ahead and say my static server CDN file folder, I'm going to make it super long on purpose. I'm going to go ahead and copy this relative path here. We're going to paste it in. And of course, we are just going to go ahead and change it from SRC to base dir and then / that static file folder. Great. So we now have two distinct locations for our static files. So if I go into my local project, I can run a command called python manage.py collect static. Now, before I hit enter, let's take a look at UX. It just says custom.css. If I hit collect static now, what it does is it now sends a bunch of files, way more than that one single file, to this new static server CDN file folder. If I open this up, I now see that I've got all of these other files in here that are related to something in my project, right? And so what I want to see then is I want to see my custom file come in here. And what I'm only seeing right now, if I open this up a little bit, is admin. I want to see that custom file come through. So what happened is our actual static files dirs is not correctly defined. So let's go ahead and add in an S to that one. So now it's static files dirs. Now I'm going to go ahead and run collect static again. It's saying, do I want to override these files? Yes, I do. I go ahead and override them. Now I open it up. I see that there's admin in there, and then there's custom.css, which doesn't seem to have anything. So maybe I didn't save this file. So now that I save it, let's go ahead and try it again and say yes. And then now it actually shows that they are identical files in here. Okay, so this is actually a really nice feature that Django has. We can maintain and manage our CSS files right inside of our project, but the ones we actually want to use in production are going to be stored somewhere else. You can think of this as a public folder, right? So you can think of it kind of like that, or a dist folder, or some sort of folder that, hey, this is going to be only at production. Now, the way I think of it is just simply static_root, and then this UX here as static files. Now, why is it those names? Why did I call them those names? Well, it has everything to do with what the actual definitions are inside of Django. So we've got static root here. I want to keep this in as static root as well. And then the static files dirs, well, what do you know? Static files, right? And so static files dirs, I can have multiple ones of those if I'd like. But the idea, of course, is static root itself, we would never actually send to Git. Only the files that we intend to maintain, we will send to Git. Once we want to load them, we need to run collect static, which will bring them all into the static root place to actually be able to run them. So in other words, I want to grab this path here for the static root, go into .gitignore, and then we're going to go ahead and add in that file path as well to ensure that it is not added to Git. Static files, on the other hand, we will definitely keep. And then, of course, the next thing would be maybe this static root folder. We can go ahead and ensure that it exists by doing make dir exists okay being true and parents being true. So this is very specific to when we intend to build it at some point. Now, what this did not do is it actually did not solve the production issue with this. all it did was solve the managing of these static files so that when we go into production, we can implement something that will actually load in the static files root, or the static root directory, the external static file server. In our case, we're going to be using Django and more specifically WhiteNoise. But at this point, this would be a time to either choose between WhiteNoise, which is a really low stakes way to set this up, which is what we're going to do, or something like Django Storages, which is more advanced, but then you get a lot of capabilities that you don't get with WhiteNoise. One of them is handling user file uploads. Django Storages is a package for this, so you can actually use stuff like Amazon S3, you can use Cloudflare R2, DigitalOcean Spaces. There's a lot of object storage backends that you would end up using, especially if you have a lot of demand for even more static files. So if you have massive amounts of static files, like a lot of images that support your Django project, then you're going to want to upgrade into Django Storages. Now, when I say a lot of images, I mean images that you as the developer or the development team maintain and control. That's what this static files folder is for. It is not for user uploads. That's something completely different that we did not set up here, which of course would be something you would want to learn about if you want to handle user static uploads, which is another reason to use Django Storage. This one's outside the scope of this course here, but if you want to learn more about it, let me know. For the rest of us, let's jump into taking a look at WhiteNoise now so we can actually serve our static files in production. We're now going to configure WhiteNoise with Django. The point of this is to serve our static files in production right next to Django. Once your project gets a little bit more robust, or you have a lot of static files, you're going to want to drop WhiteNoise in favor of something like Django Storages, where then a object storage server like AWS S3 or Cloudflare R2 will actually serve your static files for you. That, of course, is another set of configurations that is outside the scope of this series. WhiteNoise is incredibly easy to set up, as we'll see in just a moment. Now, the first thing that I want to implement is the Brotli compression. So if we come down into Brotli compression here, we're going to go ahead and pip install WhiteNoise Brotli, and we'll go ahead and bring it into our requirements.txt. This adds a level of configuration that we definitely want to have to make it as efficient as possible. So we're going to go ahead and run our pip install here. So pip install -r and then requirements.txt just to make sure that WhiteNoise is installed. So the next step then, after we do that, we can take a look at make sure your static files is configured correctly. Now, this is where we can see how our understanding of static root will make a major impact in how we design our project, right? So if we take the documentation here, we can see that it says our static root is static files. But in our case, it is not that. That is quite literally the opposite of what we want it to be. Our case, we have static root in the static root folder. Our static files are in the static files folder. These are, of course, two very distinct definitions, but if you didn't understand these two things, and I hope you do now, then you would see this and go, oh, I should probably just replace this right here, and boom, I'm good to go. In our case, of course, we do not want to do that. I much prefer naming the folder based off of the actual configuration itself. As you can see, static files and static root. Great. So hopefully you understand that at this point. And then, of course, loading in your static files. This is something that's fairly straightforward, but whenever you want to use static, you're going to do something like this. We'll see this in just a moment as well, just so you can get a sense as to what's going on. Next up, we want to enable WhiteNoise, which of course is going into our settings middleware, which is really just this simple. We just copy the WhiteNoise middleware, we go into settings.py, and then we are going to want to scroll on up into middleware. Right after security middleware, you go ahead and paste that in. So what's happening here, of course, is this will now, or should now, load in our middleware itself. Our WhiteNoise will now be rendered, which is pretty cool. But of course, we could deploy it now, but there is one more step that I want to set up, which of course was the stuff for Brotli to make sure that we are compressing these files, in which case I'm going to go ahead and grab this other configuration in here for storages, which I'm going to put right underneath all of our static files here and just paste it like that. So this adds in the compression so that Brotli actually works. and it does more efficiently serve our static files, which is something we want. And especially since it's really easy to just add it, then boom, we are on there. Okay, great. So there is one more thing that we want to do, and that is using WhiteNoise in development. We've got this command here for whitenoise.runServer no static. What's run server no static? Well, if we go into our local project here and I close out my server and then I run server and do -- no static as one word, hit enter, I can now actually go into my Django project, and what I should see is maybe the static files showing up, maybe not, right? So right now they're actually showing up, and this is in large part because of WhiteNoise. So if I actually were to get rid of WhiteNoise, let's go ahead and get rid of that middleware here. Let's see if that actually removes the files themselves. There they are. So they're actually removed when I run that, no static file server, because WhiteNoise is quite literally off, right? And so that's a really quick way to test that. Now in the documentation, it says you can add a item into installed apps. So we just want to do that just to make sure that it's definitely in there. So you go into installed_apps.append, and then it's simply WhiteNoise in here, and then we can just double check. It's whitenoise.runServer no static, right? And so that's just another way to add that in there. And it's saying on top of your installed app list. So maybe it's not append, maybe it's insert at the beginning. But I've had plenty of success with just append. In fact, I've had success with not adding it at all, like we did in just a moment ago. Nevertheless, we now have our WhiteNoise configured, and it's really just going to be that simple. We won't need to change that much going forward. So I'll go ahead and do my git status. I'll add everything into my project here and added static files and WhiteNoise, something like that. Go ahead and commit it. Yes. And we'll go ahead and sync these changes. So I'm going to go ahead and let this run in Railway. So we're going to go ahead and see that deployment build out, and then we'll come back. All right, so the build worked. So let's go ahead and take a look. If I look in my admin project now, I get this server error. Let's take a look at the logs and see what's going on with this server error. So we got our HTTP logs, our deploy logs in here. So it's kind of hard to tell what exactly is happening here. So what I want to do then is I want to add one more command into settings.py. Now, my suspicion is that when we went to deploy this, we need to also run our collect static command. Now, you might think that it goes in pre-deploy, but I actually think it's going to go into our start command. So the first one being python manage.py collect static, and then we also want no input. Let's go ahead and just verify this locally before we finalize that. And we just want to make sure that that actually works. Sure enough, it does. So I should be able to do collect static no input and then Gunicorn running this application. So let's go ahead and try this again. Now I'm going to redeploy it. Hopefully it doesn't take nearly as long because of the custom start command. So what we're seeing here is a bunch of different commands that are going on. This right here makes me feel like, oh, I need to have a little bit more control over my entire environment. So it's kind of getting me to the point where perhaps I want to change how my container is being built. That's kind of what I'm getting at. And the answer, of course, is we will definitely do that in the near future. But the idea here is once this actually runs, hopefully we will see WhiteNoise working in production in just a moment. So I'm going to go ahead and let that one finish as well. After a few moments, it finally deployed, and then we see that 128 files were collected to that location, and then it's running the server, in which case now I can jump over to the admin here, and sure enough, there is my project, and I should be able to log in now. I didn't actually change my credentials, so let me just double check that inside of mine, inside of the variables here. Go ahead and copy that one, and we'll log in here, and sure enough, there it is. It looks a lot better. It's nice and polished, and things are looking pretty good. Okay, so jumping back into the admin, let's actually take a look at how we can use one of those static files real quick, or not to the admin, but the root project itself. So if we go into our templates here, we got our hello world. What we can do is we can bring in load static here, and then we come in and I believe it's a CSS file. So we're going to go ahead and do link real equals to the style and sheet. And then we'll go href, as in the location itself is going to be those style sheets. So it's going to be static and then the relative path to custom.css. In our case, the only relative path in here is relative to the parent folder itself. That's going to be true for static root or static files. So in our case, it's actually just simply custom.css. So we can go ahead and save that. And now we're going to go ahead and say, added CSS static file or something like that, commit it, and then we'll go ahead and sync those changes and we'll let that push. And of course, inside of Railway, it will go ahead and build it out. Now, in many cases, you're probably not going to want to have it custom CSS like that, but instead of you would do something more along the lines of, say, app and then custom.css and move it like that, to where then in your hello world, you would change it to now being app custom CSS. The reason has to do with the collect static command, because if we were to run collect static again, we can now see that, oh, there's my app here, or better yet, even saying something like project. And the main thing is we don't want to override the defaults that are in there. So you're probably not going to want to come in here and call it admin, unless of course you're trying to override the admin CSS itself. So now that we've got this, I'm going to go ahead and change it again. So new change again for locations. Now, actually what would be better to make it fully change is change the body color to, let's say for instance, blue, for example, just to see if that change ends up happening. In which case now new change again, we'll commit that one. Not going to push it just yet. I'm going to wait until that previous deployment finishes, which it might already be done. So if I go into production now, there it is, nice and red. So it's definitely working there. Now that it's nice and red, let's go ahead and see if we can make it nice and blue. So once I actually finish the push, I'll let it finish deploying, which will take about a minute. So it finished deploying. Let's go ahead and jump into our admin or our project now, our production app. And if I refresh, now it is blue. Now, the nice thing about this, if we look on our elements here into the head tag, what we will see is custom dot and then some numbers in here. So it basically hashes this so that when you do make those changes, it actually does change the file name as well when it's in production. But on our local machine, we don't have to do that, right? So it's just still custom CSS. Now, of course, the body color, that's not actually something I want to use in here at all, right? So it's definitely something you could keep if you like, or in our case, I'm just going to go ahead and get rid of it. And now we'll just go ahead and do git status add, and then, removed custom CSS styles, and just go ahead and push that. Now, there's a good chance that it might have errors if it's empty CSS, but I don't know. If it is empty, then just remove it from the template itself. If for some reason it's having errors, just go ahead and delete that. The main thing here is that we now have a way to load in our static files overall. Now, the last question you might have had was inside of our settings, why is it that we didn't put collect static in the pre-deploy, but rather in this start command? This has to do with how containers are built, how Docker containers are built in their sequential nature as to how they end up working. So the reason the migrate command ended up working is because there's this third-party tool in here that we actually end up using to run our database. Our collect static is not a third-party tool. It's done inside of our project. The caveat would be if we did use Django storages, then the collect static would work basically whenever we ran Django storages, because inside of Django storages, then you would have specific variables to connect to the third-party static file server, which in our case, we don't have that at all, which means that we need to run that command, that deployment command, we need to run it right next to where we actually run the application itself. Because in many ways, this is preparing the static file server to make sure it has all of those static files to run itself. Now, I do recommend testing that theory out, but I think you'll come to find that if you do it in the pre-deploy command, you just won't get those static files whatsoever. We're now going to configure our Django project to send email through Gmail. Now, the primary reason for this in deployment has everything to do with 500 server errors. So if you ever see those server errors in Django, we will automatically get an email about them if we actually set up email itself. Now, every once in a while, you might also want to set up emails to happen at different phases of going into production. So for example, you could absolutely set up an email to be sent with GitHub Actions. You could also set an email up when the actual project is built in Railway or deployed in Railway. Both things can send email as well, which is super nice. But the thing is, we need to set up some sort of configuration for that. Now, we are using Gmail because it's free, but the downside of Gmail is it's not a transactional email service. So transactional email is designed specifically for software to be able to send out email for you that's not related to marketing. So it's related to server errors, or, if you want to check, like send this email to confirm your email address itself, like for users, you can do stuff like that. So the idea here is we would use Gmail temporarily in the short run, and then eventually we'd want to upgrade to a transactional email service, which there are many. I've used Loops, I've used Resend, I've used SendGrid, I've used Amazon SES. All of them work very similar to what we're doing here. There are some exceptions to that, but the idea is we're using the same sort of mechanism that's built into Django to be able to send out emails for us. Now, you can also build out your own email server to send emails to, which is not something I recommend, has everything to do with deliverability. As in, when you send an email, does the recipient actually even see that email? That's a whole nother question that transactional email services, it's part of their actual service that they have to be able to deliver those emails. Otherwise, you wouldn't use them. So with this in mind, we're going to use Django with Gmail here. And I've got this blog post that will be linked in the description. But the idea is we want to grab the configuration, the default configuration we've got on here. And inside of settings.py, I'm going to go ahead and paste this in. And then I'm going to go ahead and navigate down a little bit and grab the .env example in here. We'll paste this in as well. And it's going to look like that. And then I'm also going to go ahead and grab in this admin username and email in here as well. We'll bring that back into settings too. And then I'm going to go ahead and set my admin user email being equal to the same exact email as my host user up there. Okay. And then there is another setting that's not on this blog post, but it has to do with the server email. This one would be, what is the server sending from? So in our case, the server email is going to be the same as the host email itself. So we'll go ahead and set those to being the same value, which means Gmail and Gmail. So basically via Gmail itself, instead of doing something like root at localhost. That's kind of the default there. There's another one called the default from email, which would also be this same value, which of course is going to be that email host user. Now, when you use a transactional email service, these ones could also be different, but still actually use the same user. The transactional emails, when you actually implement those, you might have just a username. You might not actually have an email account as the username. So that's going to be different given whatever host user you end up using. This is a username and password to log into some account at this host to then send email. And then how that email is sent is going to be different based off of these two values right here, which again, the transactional email services do this really well. The reason I'm bringing this up is mostly because of SES. So Amazon SES, if you were to send out that or set that up, your username is going to be an Amazon user. It's going to be like 123 or something like that, not an actual email address. Then when you go to send it, that will be one of these, like your server email or your default from, depending on what functionality you end up using. Okay, so with this in mind, let's go back into .env and start actually setting this up to run. Now we've got an email port here and use TLS. These things I'm going to go ahead and just get rid of because the default values that I set in settings.py are going to be set in there for those. And it looks like use SSL should be in there like that. So just to make sure that those things are correct. And of course, there's a few comments in here. So the real ones that we're setting are the username, the password, and then the host for Gmail itself. So those are the main ones. Okay, so where do we actually get this email host password? What you can't use in terms of Gmail is the actual username password, as in logging into Gmail. That password, whatever that password is, that's not the one you can use. Instead, what you have to do is you have to go into your account, into your actual Gmail account, go to manage your Google account, go into security, make sure that you have two-step verification activated, add as many verification things that you need, your phone number, whatever, any sort of two-step verification in there. After you do that, you're going to search for app passwords. And what this should show you is this right here with security underneath it. As soon as you click this, it's going to ask you to log in again. After you log in, you'll see something like this. In my case, I'm going to give my app name of Django Dev. I'm going to go ahead and create this. I'm going to copy whatever this value is right here. Now, the cool thing is you can delete this value literally anytime. So there it's deleted. Now I can go ahead and create a new one. So if you think of this as like an API key, you're on the right track. So we've got a username and API key, but in our case, the username is our actual email address. This is the API password, if you will. And then we want to bring this into our project here, which is going to go right there, just like that. Great. So simple enough, right? So if you needed to have a production version, you could just come in here and put it in as prod. Go ahead and hit create, grab this value, go back into Railway, go into your project itself, into your variables. We're going to go ahead and add a new one. I'm going to paste that value in first. Then I'm going to go ahead and jump into the key for it. I'm going to go ahead and add that now. I might as well add these other keys in here as well. So I'll go into the raw editor and just paste them in there as well. I'll also go ahead and add in the admin user and paste that in. Okay, and let's just verify if we need anything else, which I think we do, which is, well, we could put our admin username in there as well if we wanted to. And of course, if these were actually based off of environment variables, then we would put those in there as well. So I think these configurations just fine. I'm going to go ahead and update them and start that deployment process. Now, I actually haven't changed the code at all, so I don't really need to worry about the code just yet, but I just wanted to make sure those variables are available already. Okay, so with this in mind, let's go ahead and actually test this out. So I want to flush out any sort of environment variables I might have. So I'm just going to go into src and then run python manage.py, send test email, and then --admins, hit enter. And what we should get is no error, right? As in it just worked, or at least it seems like it just worked. So if I go back into Gmail, what I should get in here is something like this. This email was sent to the site admins. So this right here, I actually want to see if I can use it during my build process. When I go to build it or deploy it, I want to see if I can actually do this. So I'm going to start that off first. I'm going to go ahead and do the send test email to the admins in that process right there. Now, if I do it right now, it should actually error out, as in this first deployment, because the code is not available or set up, that first one should probably error out. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. We will see in a moment. But I also want to just go ahead and say, update my configuration. So email added, go ahead and commit that, say yes, sync those changes. And then of course, that's now going to go ahead and send it in and trigger another build process. But I would imagine that this would actually error out because there is no configuration. But it is also possible that it doesn't error out. It just says, oh, it can't send it. And so it keeps going. So in other words, it's not necessarily a step that will cause an error. This won't raise a major error if it does not work according to what we've got here. Looks like it didn't have any errors whatsoever deploying that previous one. So we're in good shape. But now, of course, it's actually building out the email added, and in which case we should now have that transactional email going, and we will be able to test it later. Now let's go ahead and add in a custom domain to our Railway application or our Railway deployment. In this case, of course, it's a Django deployment, but what we're going to do is we're going to jump into settings, into networking, and then we're going to go ahead and select custom domain. And in here, we'll go ahead and add in our custom domain. Now, the key thing here is you either own this domain or you control it, or both, right? So if you control it, what I mean by that is you can actually change the DNS values, the DNS records. So let's go ahead and grab that domain name, actually map it to the correct port, just like you have on your other domain name from Railway directly. And then we're going to go ahead and add this. As soon as you do that, you'll see this prompt right here. And this means that we actually want to map our domain name to actually work within Railway itself, so Railway can do all of the routing correctly. And so this is where we then use something like Cloudflare. Now, I like using Cloudflare for a lot of the built-in security features that it has, as well as many other things for domains. That is something outside the scope of what we want to talk about here. But the idea is once you actually sign up for Cloudflare, you're going to add your domain name in here. When you go to add it, it's going to ask you to change your DNS record. So if you do abc.com, for example, and you hit quick scan for this, of course, I don't own abc.com, but I can still try to add it to my account, but it won't ever actually end up finishing. It will just hang and hang and hang. But the idea is once I actually do set it up, I can then go in and see that I need to change. Look at all these DNS records that are already in here, but I would actually need to go and grab the value for it, right? So these DNS records right here would be for this domain name. But again, I don't actually own this one, so I'm going to go ahead and remove it from my account because it's not actually active at all. But that process is free. The key part is that you change your domain name servers or your DNS records to the specific name servers that Cloudflare has. In this case, here's a domain name I actually do own that has the name servers correct. Once you do that, it might take a little bit of time before you can actually change the DNS records. In this case, I already have it on here, so I can come in and just go ahead and do CNAME in here, just like Railway said, CNAME at, and then this value. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this value here, and then I'll jump in here. At is, of course, the root domain name, and then I can go ahead and paste this in. Notice that there's this proxy here. We want to keep that proxy on. This allows your web traffic to go through Cloudflare, so you get a lot of the security benefits that Cloudflare has. I'm not going to go through all of them, but it is super nice that that's there. I'll go ahead and save that. As soon as I save that and jump back into my Railway project in here, I should see that it is going to show me the DNS value for the proxy itself. So we'll go ahead and see this in a little bit some more too. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and add in the next record, which of course is going to be our www.hungrypie.com, same port. Go ahead and add that in. Notice that the Cloudflare proxy was detected. We'll see that again in just a moment. But I'm going to go ahead and grab this one. We'll bring it in, add in another CNAME in here, and then it's going to be www. And then there we go. Again, the proxy. There we go. Everything's looking good. We'll go ahead and save that. And now we've got two domains that will end up going to our Railway application. So I can go ahead and dismiss this. And now it shows me that one of them has the Cloudflare proxy detected. The other one will here very soon as well. So in other words, Railway knows how to work with Cloudflare proxies really well. It's a native thing that it does. And now if I were to open up my HungryPie app, I might get this problem here. It might not be working quite well yet. And that has to do with the Railway proxy itself. So if we go into SSL and TLS, what we want to configure in here is instead of it being in flexible mode, we want it in full or maybe even full strict. Let's try full strict. I'm going to go ahead and save that. I'll refresh in hungrypie.com. And I think in the very near future, this will start working. We might have to wait for it to fully clear out its cache or something like that. We can also try www, in which case it did work, and now I get a bad request of 400. And if you have your email set up correctly, you should see an email come through giving us an invalid host header. This is a Django security feature that is working alongside of a Cloudflare security feature as well. We can also try just root HungryPie. Right now it doesn't seem to be working, but then it goes, and there we go. Okay, so there's a couple of other features that we can add into Cloudflare just for security purposes. So one of them, if we were to go into rules here, we can create a brand new rule. And what we want to do here is we want to grab a rule based off of our project. So if we actually look at some of the templates for the rules, we've got this redirect HTTP to HTTPS. Yeah, we absolutely want to do that. So we can redirect that just like that. Go ahead and hit deploy. You might even preserve the string itself. So if we scroll back down, you can preserve the query string. Like if there's a query that comes in like search equals to ABC, you want to preserve that. You can just hit that tick there. Go ahead and save that. This means that all HTTP requests will now be HTTPS. And that's on the Cloudflare side. That's part of the reason we use a proxy. If we look at the templates again, we can also see redirect from www to root. This means that it's going to go to the root domain, which is maybe what you want to do. In this case, I'll leave that on as well. Once again, I'll preserve that. There's not a whole lot I need to know or do beyond that other than just deploy it. Now it's going to do these two redirects for us. So jumping back into our project here, I'll go ahead and do my www.hungrypie.com, hit enter. Cloudflare itself should do those redirects, and then it actually does. Django still gives us that error, and we should see a bunch of errors now inside of Django. Great. So Cloudflare has other features for sure, but for now what I want to do is jump back into settings, and I want to just make sure that these hosts actually work. So in my case, I'll do .hungrypie.com, and then I'll also go ahead and grab the trusted origin for that as well, and then I'll go ahead and set this up just like that and save that as well. Then we'll go ahead and add allowed host. We'll commit that, say yes, and then sync those changes, say okay. Okay, so the cool thing about using Cloudflare as our domain name security is we don't necessarily have to add in all of the extra security that Django does. Now you definitely can. There are other things. If we remember back to the Django deployment checklist, what you can see in here are things related to HTTPS, right? So HTTPS, hey, you want to make sure that you're doing that. So in which case you have these two configurations that you can also add with HTTPS. So in this case, I'll go ahead and copy these configurations. Let's go ahead and copy them like that. And then I'll go right up below the trusted origins here. We'll paste them in. And all I want to do is set these to equal to not debug. Basically the opposite of debug. Whatever debug is, I'm going to go ahead and set it to the opposite of that. So if debug is true, these are going to be false. If debug is false, these are going to be true. So that's just for the HTTPS of it all. Now these things are also well in place to a degree with the fact that we have Cloudflare up front. But this is added security for Django. We'll go ahead and commit that, yes, and then I'll go ahead and sync those changes, okay. Now all I need to do is just go back into Railway, see if our project was deployed. It looks like it was deployed recently. Granted, I just added another one, but the allowed host should work now. So I should be able to go to my custom domain, in this case, hungrypie.com, refresh, and I should be able to see my Django project. I should be able to go to the admin and see the admin stuff in there. So at this point, I can decide whether or not I want to have my custom domain name and my Railway domain name, which you might not. You might want to just delete this one altogether. The nice thing about that one is we can generate it whenever we want to. But at this point, we only have these two domain names in here. Now, one of the things you're seeing is this one is now waiting for a DNS update. I think the reason for that it might show up every once in a while has to do with the fact that we configured it to redirect. So if it's doing a check and it's not actually connecting on the Railway, we can probably be okay with that, knowing that we did this redirect in here. Of course, we could always delete that redirect, in which case it would serve on both places. And that's going to be up to you. But the idea here is we've got our deployments going. All of the host header issues should be gone now. And this is one of those main reasons to have all of that email set up, is so you can see these things. So if I were to select all this and comment it all out, not sure why that one won't let me comment it, but let's go ahead and do that. Then now we have our deployment up and our Django project is working, and it is a custom domain altogether. When we push our code to GitHub and then Railway grabs it, it ends up building something. So now we're going to ask the question of, what is it building? So inside of the build logs, we can scroll on up and we can see that it says using Nixpacks. It's also showing that it's got Python 3 and it's doing some virtual environment stuff. It's using the start commands that we gave it. So it is doing some stuff that's really interesting. Now, of course, if we actually look up Nixpacks, what we will end up seeing is that it produces an OCI compliant image that can be deployed anywhere. Now, what is OCI? Well, it is originally pioneered by Docker. So if you ever heard of a Docker container, that is what modern Docker containers are called, which is just Open Container Image, or OCI for short. So Nixpacks actually helps automate this process to build out your different Docker container images without you necessarily needing to customize a bunch of things. Now, you absolutely can customize all sorts of things with Nixpacks directly, but what we're going to do is bring in our own Dockerfile. Now, I'm going to start off where I just copy a pre-existing one that I created specifically for Django, and then we'll modify it as we go forward. So go ahead and jump over to this blog post right here, scroll on down to where you'll see the Dockerfile. It says, with this in mind, here's the Dockerfile. Go ahead and copy this and jump into your project and create Dockerfile, and then paste this in. We'll save it. We'll go ahead and say added Dockerfile, commit, and yes, then we'll go ahead and sync these changes and push it. So I didn't make any changes to this Dockerfile, not yet at least. We will make changes in a little bit. The point here is that if we look inside of Railway now, what we see is it's added Dockerfile. We jump into settings. If we look in the build process, we see that now it says Dockerfile. Had you looked at this before, it would have said build file. And so we could obviously override, have a custom build command in here if we wanted to. We can add some watch paths in here if we wanted to as well. but our deploy, our pre-deploy and start commands are still the same. Now, these may or may not work. I have an intuition that they will not work based off of my design of this Dockerfile. So if we go back into the Dockerfile itself, now we can start customizing it just a little bit to make sure that it's working with what we've got. So first and foremost, we see that Python's in here. That's great. It's creating a virtual environment. Also great. It's adding that virtual environment to the path of this project, running pip installs, doing some system level installs, and then it's making a folder called code. And then we are moving into that working directory of code. It's copying over the requirements.txt. That's great. It's copying src or /src into code. This is our first red flag, or a flag that we should be aware of at least. Then we see that it does the installations. This, of course, is copying the local file of requirements to an absolute path inside of the container image itself. Then it runs the installation. Now, this is worth pausing for just a moment to mention that what is a container image directly? Well, it's a mini virtual machine. If you think of a container image, every single one as a tiny operating system, you're on the right track. There's a lot more you can learn about how these things work, but the idea is if we specify absolute paths in a container image, that's totally okay. And it's very, very common to do, especially with individual projects like this. So this OPT VENV, this is an absolute path to the virtual environment. This TMP, or temporary file for requirements.txt, it's an absolute path for that. So when we do this pip install, it's doing the absolute path versus what we've been doing is a relative path to where we're calling the command. That's actually a key part of this. Now, another key part is we change our working directory to code. This could be almost anything. We could call it app, we could call it API, we could call it Django project is cool. We can call it whatever we'd like. Code is one of the ones that you'll see fairly often. Every once in a while, you might see SRC, but part of the reason I didn't call it SRC was to really distinguish it from our local version of SRC. This is that right here. We are copying that local version into the container version of the code itself, which is a key part of this. Then we scroll down and we see some different commands in here. This creates a runtime script. We'll talk about that in a second. And then it actually removes some stuff and then tries to run this runtime script. Okay, great. So this is the run command. Now, if we actually take a look at our deployment, we see that it failed. And it has to do with these two commands right here. These ones are actually overriding that default run command that's in there. Dockerfiles have that ability. The reason this failed is because it moved into SRC. It changed into the folder of SRC. As you might recall, I copied the contents of SRC into code. In other words, code/SRC does not exist. So there's no SRC folder to change into. So all I need to do is remove these things like this. This is just a slight change to what we had before, but now I changed the pre-deploy and custom start commands, and this should now build and work just fine like it was. Now, the other reason I wanted to show you this was because eventually we won't need these two different declarations. We would use something more like this, our own custom script, which we'll do very, very soon. But for now, this is a custom deployment. This is a custom container that we are now have complete control over from a Docker perspective itself. And so the reason for that has to do with any third-party packages that might need operating system dependencies. Like in this case, if you were to do pip install pillow, you might need this package right here in order for pillow to work correctly. I think there's things for NumPy as well that you might need to install on this. These are Ubuntu Linux, so Ubuntu Linux OS deps that you would end up adding into your Dockerfile itself, and you might need that with different Python packages depending on what you're working on. But of course, now that we understand that, we have the ability to run our container as it is. Notice that the files were copied to code/static root in the deploy logs, in the HTTP logs. We believe that this would end up working now, so let's go ahead and open it up and see if it is actually in fact running. There's a chance that it's not. There's a chance that it's down, and it might have everything to do with our command for starting it. So let's go back into that deploy command. This right here might be causing the issue, and I'm pretty sure that it is. So what we need to do is create our own custom runtime script. We're now going to create our own runtime script for the Dockerfile directly. We're going to go ahead and open up a new folder called boot, and I'm going to go ahead and create a file called docker-run.sh. Now, what do I want to do in here? Well, the way we do this is by going back into Railway, looking into our settings for our two commands. So I'm going to go ahead and copy the pre-deploy command and also the collect static command, just like that. So we're going to go ahead and put these line by line and basically have them run in the very near future inside of this script itself. So of course we need to make this part actually work. How do we do this? Well, this docker-run.sh will actually go inside of the Dockerfile itself. So what we want to do then is we're going to jump back into the Dockerfile and we're going to go ahead and run something like copy the local file of boot/docker-run.sh, and we're going to go ahead and copy it to opt docker-run.sh. Now, there's a reason I'm copying it to opt. This is a common place to put optional files in here or extra code, much like our virtual environment is in there as well. I'm just putting my runtime script in there also. Then, of course, after I have this, I also want to go ahead and then run chomod +x of that runtime script. This allows me to actually run it, and then the final command that we'll use in here is going to be running that runtime script altogether. Okay, so these are going to be our new 3 steps. We won't necessarily have to have all of these steps in here. Now, one of the steps we could do in our build command would be this run collect static. So after we do the installation, we can do this run collect static. This will actually add our static files to the container itself on build, right? Whereas the run.sh, this will add them on run, which is a different time. So let's go ahead and notice that here, and this will be on run time. Okay, so in that case, I actually don't want it on runtime. These are the only ones that I might want to have on runtime. Build time, collect static, totally fine. Runtime, not so much. Okay, so the next question again is going to be, okay, so now that we've got all of this stuff kind of figured out, I'm going to go ahead and also use this cleanup and put it right above the command. But all of these other commands I probably don't need any longer because I've got my own runtime script in here. Okay, so now that we've got this actual runtime command, what is it that I'm trying to run? Well, of course I want to run Gunicorn, but where? Well, if we go back into our Dockerfile, we've got a working directory at /code. So realistically, this Docker run needs to navigate into /code to run all this. But as you might recall, when we created our Django project, we also need to activate our virtual environment. Now, where is that located? Back into our Dockerfile, it's at an absolute path right here. So all we need to do is source venv bin/activate. Now, keep in mind, the way we do all of this is going to be the same for all of us. That's the key of Docker. That's something that's really nice. So whether you're on Mac, Linux, or Windows, this script is going to be the same. This Dockerfile is going to be the same. That's a key part of all of that. So now we have a way to activate our virtual environment. We navigate to where our code is so that we can run all of the management commands as well as Gunicorn on all of this stuff right here. We also want to go ahead and add in something like this where it's bin/bash. This just tells the actual Linux server or the actual Linux container that we are going to be running this inside of the bash shell itself. That's just a key part of that versus something like bin/python, for example. Okay, so this is now a script that we will be able to run. So we actually want to start that process here very, very soon. But there's one other thing that we want to be aware of, and that is our actual runtime values in here. So what we've got is we've got a runtime port of 8080. So I'm going to leave in that runtime port of 8080. I'll just go ahead and export that runtime port of 8080, and I'll go ahead and use it down here, just like that. Okay, so I'll leave those things in here, and hopefully we've got everything set up really well. I'm going to go into my container here. It looks like our Dockerfile and our Docker run is ready. So added runtime script. I'm going to go ahead and commit it and say yes. I'm not going to sync the changes yet, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back into Railway and I'm going to get rid of these custom commands in here. I no longer want them on there because I want that script to run on its own. I'll go ahead and deploy this. It certainly might run on its own with the old version, but now it's very specific to all of the things we wanted with our project. So now I'll go ahead and sync these changes and let that run. And so it's going to go ahead and jump into our deployments, and we should get that runtime script in there, in which case it will be built out. Now, what I want to do as well is the host itself. So I'm also going to do export runtime host and set that equal to 0000. Now, it's certainly possible we probably don't need to write export here at all. You can probably just have the variables like that, and then we can come in and change them like this. Okay, great. So these are hard-coded variables. They do not take into account a environment variable. So let's say, for instance, we want to set an environment variable to change our port. Maybe we want to change our new environment variable to port 8081. So in other words, we come in here and we go into our variables, we create a new variable, we change a port in here to 8081, right? So let's say, for instance, that's something I want to do at some point, which in case I would deploy it. So how do we actually support that in this runtime script? Now, the way we do that is by using the string substitution here, which is $ curly brackets around 8080. Then the actual environment variable we want to use, which in this case is port, then colon minus. Now the colon minus, this right here will go to the port environment variable. Otherwise, it'll fall back on 8080. We want to do that same thing with the runtime host. So it's going to fall back on 000. The runtime host is going to be able to be changed as well. So that's the reason that I wanted to do those two, and I also wanted to show you how it's done. So with this in mind, I'll go ahead and say, we'll add this again, and updated runtime port and host. Go ahead and commit that. Yes. And then we'll go ahead and sync those changes actually in just a moment. So let's go ahead and see if the other ones ended up working just fine. So we look at our deployments and we get executable, that file cannot be found. So let's go back into our code here, and I'm just going to go ahead and get rid of that period and see if that ends up doing it for us. I think that might end up doing it. We might have to do something a little bit different, but let's go ahead and try that one. And we'll go ahead and say updated Dockerfile again and hit commit. Yes, and we'll sync those two changes now. So we should have the runtime environment and be able to call that script directly. And so hopefully that ends up working. Let's go ahead and let that build out so we can see. I will also go ahead and deploy that new change as well. That might also help us with the port itself. But of course, I did change the port to something that maybe I don't want to change just yet. Let's keep it at 8080 just to get everything working, because that's the port we've been using. So we'll definitely come back to that in just a moment. Let's let the build end up finishing. Now, if for some reason the build fails again, this is where we can actually do something like bin/bash and run it like that. So that would be another option for running the command so that we have the ability to run that script directly. And it looks like it is running though. So if we look in here into our deploy logs, we should see that, yeah, it did actually run it when it was just the absolute path like that, which is great. So then in our actual Hungry Pi app, there it is. It's now running, and it's now working based off of the port value that we set and the runtime script. So the last thing that I want to do is just change that port value. Let's just verify that that's working. We will change the port value to 8081 again, and then I'm going to go ahead and change or add another variable for our host, and I'm going to change that to being the IPv6, the actual different IP version for Gunicorn, so it works with private connections as well. But the idea is we now have these two values that we're going to be changing. So I'm going to go ahead and run that. I let those environment variables finish, and so now we can see that Gunicorn is listening at these values here. So this is for internal private communication if we ever need it. And then 8081, of course, is our new port value, which means that we need to jump into settings, into networking, and we need to change these ports in here to the correct ones. So we'll go ahead and use it based off of Gunicorn that it detects. We can update it that quickly. It shouldn't require a new deploy, and we're going to want to do that in both of our domains here so that everything is working correctly, so that I can open up my project, and there we go. We now have a custom runtime commit file that is running alongside of Docker. This is a little bit easier to also now make changes to and keep track of those changes. I think one of the things about doing it inside of the settings directly is the fact that we don't actually see these things changed. Like, for example, if I accidentally deleted one step in there, I might not see them. Where now I can see the Git version control history of the things that I might want to change at the runtime for this particular project. One such example would be this auto admin. Maybe now I don't want to have that on there anymore, but it might be nice to keep that command available. So if I ever need to use this again, I'll see that I've got this auto admin in there. This also might be true for the send test emails. Maybe you don't want to send those when it starts running, but the thing you definitely do want to do is run the migrate command. Or maybe you don't. Maybe you don't want to actually have that running at runtime. Instead, if it hasn't been migrated, your database itself, the runtime would then fail and you'd have to fix something really quickly, because you might not want to automatically have it migrate if you're working with a lot of people on a single Django project. So that's something else to be aware of at this point. We're now going to take a look at Railway config as code to add a bunch of variables that we might want to use when we deploy our project directly into Railway. So if we go into settings here and you look at config as code, there's docs for this that we can go through. So we can use railway.json or railway.toml. Either one is fine. I'm going to go ahead and stick with doing railway.json. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this and we'll jump into our local project and I'll do railway.json in here, and then we'll go ahead and take a look at a few different items for it. So here's an example that we are going to go off of. I'm going to copy this and we will go ahead and paste it into railway.json. So as we see inside of here, I can already see that I can specify Nixpacks if I wanted to. If I still wanted to have that Dockerfile and have Nixpacks, I could totally do that. I can also do all of those commands before. So this kind of helps solve that problem. If you wanted to keep track of those different commands, railway.json would be the way to do it, so that you don't necessarily have to always do your own custom Dockerfile or have your actual direct settings done inside of deploy, right? So those custom commands definitely can be inside of this config as code, which I think is pretty cool. So what we want to do though is we want to look for the actual Dockerfile itself or the Docker build for this. And of course, we might actually need to go to the reference page for config as code, which is right here. And so we can actually take a look at all of the different options that we've got here. Possible values for the builder are Nixpacks or Dockerfile. In this case, I'll go ahead and specify Dockerfile itself. And then we want to actually take a look at the different things we might want to have. Inside of our build path, we've got a Dockerfile path here, in which case I'll go ahead and change this to Dockerfile path. And of course, that's just simply Dockerfile, right? The cool thing about this is we can change it, right? So if I had multiple in here, let's go ahead and say Dockerfile v2, then I could use Dockerfile.v2 and switch if I want to. The multiple Docker files is also nice because then I can also have multiple Railway files. So a more practical example might be v2 or like a Dockerfile for your worker instance. So if you're using something like Celery, you can have multiple Railway files and Docker files in here to make sure that those things are working. That's kind of the point of that. Now, I'm actually not going to do that here, but it is something that's really cool to use, which is another reason to use this config as code. So next up, what we've got is our deploy here. Now, a lot of the deploy stuff we might not necessarily need because of how our Dockerfile ends up working. So feel free to go through this process, but the main thing I want to look at here is the health check path and then the health check timeout. So we want to actually have both of these things set for us. So we've got our start command and our deploy commands are already done for us. Those are done in the Dockerfile and that Dockerfile script. Now the health check path, what is this going to be? Well, let's look into our Django project and look into our views here. We have this health view, which is at this URL right here. So we can actually use that health view just like that. Now, the downside of this actually comes down to when we go to deploy it and our allowed hosts. So for this reason, we're going to go back into the Docker container, or rather the Django container.com. We're going to go ahead and take a look at the reference that's in there. So looking at the code here, we're going to open this one up into SRC, into CFE home, into settings. We're going to scroll on down a little bit and look at the allowed hosts that we've got in here. Here's a few more Railway hosts that we might want to use, in which case I have all of this right here. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that, and we'll jump on over into our settings here now. And I'm going to go ahead and put these below allowed hosts and CSRF trusted hosts, and just put in all of these Railway hosts in here, not necessarily have them directly in these other ones any longer, because if there are other Railway hosts that are added, I can just add them right here. Now, in this case, it's going to be your deployment, whatever your internal deployment ends up being. So let's go ahead and take a look at that itself. Deployments here, we go into settings, we go into networking, and then we take a look at our private internal IP here. We can go ahead and bring that one in directly right there as well. So we already do have internal, so you don't necessarily have to do that, but it's nice that we can now bring in all of these different hosts. This is really important for the health path itself, which is healths. I think that's what it was. Let's go ahead and see. There's the view, and it is not, it's Heaths. So it should be healths, which is funny, but nevertheless, an important part to check. Okay, so we can also go back into this Django container as well, and we can see that railway.json is in here also, and it's got the timeout, startup timeout, and all of these different things. So I actually want to bring in a few other items in here just to make sure that all of this is done. We want to restart it, and we also want to retry it 10 times before we call it a failure based on the health path. This has everything to do with how quickly our Django project boots right here. Once it ends up booting, it should be able to get that health pack itself. And so that is going to allow us to do all sorts of things in relation to our Django project. Now, there is something else that we want to consider why I'm bringing up the Django container itself is Gunicorn. You might want to add in a bunch of other configuration for Gunicorn directly, in which case you would want to augment or change your build path itself. So if you wanted to use that Gunicorn configuration, do keep in mind that there is some stuff to do that. This will make your project even more effective, but it's outside the scope of what we're doing here. This is not required at all. It's just something you'll want to do at some point for sure to just improve Gunicorn altogether. But now that we've got this, let's go ahead and say that we added health checks and config as code. We're going to go ahead and commit that. Yes. Well, let's go ahead and sync those changes now. And this, of course, should now build it out. And then, of course, if we jump in to our Railway app, into settings, if we go into config as code, it might automatically do it. It might not. In this case, it doesn't. Well, it did. It looked like it might have. Let's see. Let me refresh in here because it did change something for me off of the video, probably because the code came in and it didn't do it yet. So I'm going to go ahead and add in railway.json here. We're going to go ahead and select that. And now I'm going to go ahead and deploy it. This is where you can define different Railway versions that you might want to have. And now notice it's showing a bunch of other stuff in here. You have the option to make it serverless as well, a health check path. This is now showing up and it's doing all of the things that you might need to do when it comes to deploying this project. Now, doing that health check might mean that initially it fails. So if you actually can't boot up your project, then it will fail. So during the build process, notice that it said right here, it's looking for that path. It has a retry window. It succeeded, so it went on and to deploy it. If we didn't actually add in the settings for all of the different hosts options for Railway, it might have failed. It might have not ever worked, which is another reason to do this altogether. We now have a production Django project, and we went through a lot of depth. Now, there are other things that we can add to our Django project to make it that much more effective. One of the things to speed it up a lot would be to implement Django Redis, for example. So the way this would work is actually fairly straightforward. First off, we would jump into Railway. We would go ahead and create a new database, a Redis database itself, and then let that spin up. While that's working, I would come into Django Redis. I would scroll on down, grab these caches here. I'm going to bring them into my Django project itself into settings.py. I'll go to the very bottom and I'll go ahead and add in Redis cache, and then we'll paste that in there. Notice that we've got a URL here. So I'll go ahead and grab something like our Redis URL equals to config of the Redis URL. Now you might call it cache URL or something like that. I'm going to set a default being 0 or empty basically. And then I'll go ahead and say if Redis URL, then I'll go ahead and add those into my caches, and then I'll go ahead and do something along those lines. So once we have that, we need to add in Django Redis as well, which of course would be installing this right here. And we'll go ahead and bring it in just like that. And I'll go ahead and say something like added Django Redis, and I'll hit commit, yes. And then I'll go ahead and sync those changes and say, okay. Of course, locally, I'd probably want to install this as well, just to make sure that that's all in there and running. But of course, also locally, I don't actually have a Redis URL, so it's not going to have any errors most likely because of my settings here. Now, doing the cache itself is a great idea because it helps you speed up things. Now, of course, my Django project is pretty bare bones, so I don't have really a good use case for it just yet. But the idea here is we now have the ability to then come into our Django project, add in these variables here, add in a new variable like Redis URL, grab the non-public URL, go ahead and add that, and then deploy that project. Now we could also go on our local one and grab the public URL as well. We can copy that, bring this into our local.env, and then come in and say Redis URL, set that equal to that, and then we might work. It might work now. Let's go ahead and see if it does. So Python manage.py migrate, and I don't have any errors. I run the server. I don't think I have any errors. Let's go ahead and actually print out the Redis URL itself. I'll print it out. And it looks like it is being printed out. So it looks like it's working and the cache should be in there. So obviously I'm not going to necessarily test all that stuff out, but that would be how you would add in the Django Redis, which is definitely a package I would recommend. Now, the next step would be something for your worker processes. Now, inside of Railway, we could quite literally spin up an entire new process that's very similar to our web app process to run something like Celery. Or you can use a package I made called Django QStash that basically just turns your Django project into a webhook to allow you to run background tasks using Upstash QStash. So if you go to Upstash and grab the QStash project that they have, which is a really simple and easy way to run your various tasks that you might want to run, much like Celery, but with a lot less overhead to do it. Now, I'm not going to implement this. It takes a number of steps in here, but the idea is you decorate a task in here. It works a lot like Celery, and they can work hand in hand. But the idea is there's a lot more things that we can still add to this Django project to make it even more production capable or production ready. But the fundamentals have been covered up until this point. I just wanted to show you these few other ones that you might consider in here as well. Now, there is another one that you might consider also called pre-commit, where you actually do things before you push your code into, GitHub itself. This can run all sorts of stuff for you. You also might want to bring in something like actual Tailwind CSS on your local machine, where you build out the styles for it. Pre-commit and Tailwind can work hand in hand to actually build the final output before you actually put it into production. And of course, now that we have WhiteNoise, you could just have WhiteNoise being used, or you can upgrade it to Django storages, like I mentioned before. So as far as production is concerned on the baseline level, yeah, we're totally ready to go. On the more realistic, more practical level, you'll probably want to implement all of those other tools that I just mentioned to really get you to the next level. Now, the other thing about this is if you wanted to bring a new front end in place, I have this code for Django and Next.js, where Next.js is the only thing that actually touches the internet and then communicates with Django over the private network through Railway and through this private networking endpoint right here. And of course, you can see that it uses IPv6, which is exactly why in our deployment logs, we can see that this actual endpoint right here is being used in Gunicorn. That's why it's listening just like that. So it's actually really cool. It's really, really useful to have this private network to do all sorts of internal communication. Let's actually take a look at how to do that right now. Easily one of the key advantages to Railway is private networking. So you can spin up all sorts of services that your Django project can work with through private networking. We've already seen that. This is not that surprising. The cool thing is we can spin up something like a template I created called Jupyter Container. You can run this, create a password. I'll call it ABC123. We'll go ahead and deploy this. So the point of this is that I can use a Jupyter Notebook server to communicate privately to my Django project, which is exactly what I'm doing here. So I want to add in another variable here. We're going to call this our Django, let's say our Django endpoint or something like that. And that's going to be equal to the actual Django project itself, which was Django. And we see that there's a lot of values in here. So I'm going to go ahead and do Django dot and look at 15 more. And what we've got in here is the private domain. So we've got Django endpoint, Django private domain. Go ahead and add that and we'll deploy that to our Jupyter Notebook container. Now, one of the things that's happening here is it's actually building out a full-on user interface on the internet that we can connect to for Jupyter itself. Now, it might take a moment for it to be fully deployed because, of course, it's building a container image and then it's going to deploy it just like we saw with Django itself. But the nice thing about this is it's actually a Jupyter Notebook, so I have the ability to do interactive requests and interactive environments and stuff like that. So I'm going to let this finish building and then we'll take a look at the built version so we can connect to our Django project. The deployment is almost done, and I realized one of the things I probably should have also added in here was the Django port value, which it was 8081. So I'm just going to remember this one, but that might be another thing that I would actually want to grab directly from the Django environment variables, which we have in here as port. So you totally could do that as well. So just another way to connect it. But now that it's fully built, let's just take a look here. I've got a Jupyter Notebook server. I've got that password that I added in, which was just ABC123. Of course, if you forgot that password, just go into your variables there and then take a look at the Jupyter password right there. There it is. And so now I'm inside of a Jupyter Notebook server. I can go into this volumes here. I can go ahead and create a new Python file. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and do a private Django request. This private Django request, this actually might not work in terms of Django doing the request or response because I didn't set up Django to handle API requests here, but I'm going to go ahead and do import HTTPX and I'm going to import OS. Now the first part is OS, so os.environ and .git, and this is going to be our Django endpoint, and it should give me that. And then of course our port was something different, so I'll go ahead and say URL equals to HTTP. Let's go ahead and put it into double quotes here, HTTP // and this is going to be our value there with that port of 8081, which I'm going to go ahead and call this just simply our Django environment endpoint here. And we'll pass that in with some string substitution. And then we'll go ahead and do the endpoint being something like the health check. I hope it actually works. It might not. And let's go ahead and close it off like that. And then the response is going to be httpx.get of that URL. HTTPX is really good for IPv6, which is the private communication we're doing inside of Railway. And then let's go ahead and do r.text. I think that's the call here. Let's go ahead and run each one and we get OK. And so that's actually doing the correct request in there. If we go into the home page, let's go ahead and try that one. Now we get the home page. There's that Django project. So it actually does work on the private network. We didn't have any problems with doing that request using HTTPX. And what I could do at the same time is come into my project here and I could quite literally remove all of the Hungry Pi stuff, right? So I could quite literally do that. Or I could try to grab Hungry Pi directly. So let's go ahead and try that one now. So URL equals to https://hungrypi.com. Now I'll go ahead and try and do the request. Same request, but this time it goes over the internet. This time it goes into private networking. So the ability to do this inside of a Jupyter Notebook is really just showing you the ability to have private networking communication to Django. This is a massive unlock. If you end up doing this in the future, you could also deploy your Django project as a Jupyter container, which of course the actual Jupyter container package has all of the code. So if you go into the code there, take a look at the repo itself, you go into the build scripts. We've got our build scripts, different packages in here, but more specifically the Dockerfile. This Dockerfile, here's an example of a Dockerfile that you might want to use to build out a container itself, our Jupyter container that would then also potentially have all of your Django code as well. And so that's why I went through these installation process. It's quite a bit more involved than just a standard Django project, but the idea here is having an interactive environment that can communicate within side of Jupyter or through the private network. Now, to me, having just the private network is great. And so that's it. That, I think, is the key part of using Railway as well. So at this point, you can go ahead and delete any given service, or you could delete the entire project itself, depending on whether or not you're going to use this. That's pretty much all we're going to be covering at this time. If there are other features that you're going to want to cover yourself, feel free to let me know in the comments so we can look at them in the future. Hey, thanks for watching. Hopefully you got a lot out of this one. And thanks to Railway for sponsoring this series and bringing it to life. Now, I will say all of the code is on our GitHub at cfe.sh/GitHub. Navigate into the Deploy Django to Railway repository. This is going to be a one-to-one copy of the code that we've been doing throughout this series. Now, I also have the djangocontainer.com, which might be good reference for things we may have not covered in this project. Now, I did want to leave you with two challenges going from here. The first challenge would be to implement the Analytics API into your Railway project and integrate it in with a Django project, a production Django project, which means that you might go through the tutorial that's related to it, or you might just deploy this code directly into Railway as well. Now, after you do that, or before you do that, then implement something like Django QStash. The nice thing about this is you can actually bring in your own sort of background worker process without adding too much complexity to your Django project. This is a low stakes way to implement something like Celery without implementing all of the things related to Celery and really just building up and scaling up your own Django project. So those are two other projects that I'm really interested in right now. And of course, I'm also interested in seeing or hearing from you as to what we should do next. Please let me know in the comments. Thanks again for watching. My name is Justin Mitchell. Look forward to seeing you next time.